We're live here at MythVision Podcast. The end is nigh, ladies and gentlemen. The end is nigh. The end of superstitions and horrible ideas and illogical thinking based on this episode today. So let us have our intro and then let's get into it. Ladies and gentlemen, we are MythVision. How about everybody take a close look to our guest today, Jonathan MS Pearce. Welcome back to MythVision.
There's been a Derek-shaped hole in my life for too long.
I have been withdrawing from MS Pearce, and it is a toxic drug that I've been needing in my life as well, I must admit. Seriously, though,
your eyes aren't painted on, of course. You know, this is what's going to happen.
Look, I really do enjoy every time we get to hang out. The way that you think is unique. You've trained your mind to think in logical terms, and it's difficult. Even as a male, which they say, you know, we try to think more logically than others. It's very difficult to think the way that you do when we've been brought up and trained in these superstitions, you name it. So everybody take the opportunity to go subscribe to A Tippling Philosopher. He is an atheist. And I think you take a positive approach on atheism, right? You are a positive atheist.
Yeah, which is to say that if I was to define what atheism is, it isn't a lack of belief in God. I know a lot of atheists like that because it doesn't mean that they are saying that they have a belief, and beliefs are sometimes seen as a bit too similar to having a religion or whatever. I say I'm a positive atheist, which is to say I do have a belief. I believe that God does not exist, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is known in philosophy as a strong or a positive atheist, and the other type I was talking about, the lack of belief in gods, is a negative or weak atheist. It sounds almost pejorative, but it's not. It's just that how it's defined. But I think it's pretty important. Like if we're spending all day on the internet or writing or blogging or writing articles, books, as I do, all this kind of stuff, arguing that God doesn't exist, then I think it's fair enough for me to say I have a belief that God does not exist. I think that's, you know, the most accurate way to describe me. Technically, I'm an agnostic atheist because, you know, there's always that element of doubt and everything. But yeah,
like is there a probability or something, you know, like possible? Yeah. Sure, I guess. But you're not convinced, and you don't live here every day wondering when that unicorn is going to pop out at you, you know? So I get what you're trying to say. Is it possible that unicorns exist?
Yeah, so these things are probability statements, aren't they? You know, I believe that God does not exist. Obviously not 100%, because the only thing that I would believe 100% is cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So this thinking entity, which is me, whatever this might be, exists, right?
Right.
In some sense, but everything else is a probability. So the claim that you exist is just something I have to. I could be a brain in a vat. I can't prove that I'm not, you know, in the matrix or whatever. So therefore there are these kind of little faith statements we have to get over. Mm-hmm. Like I kind of have faith that it's difficult. I don't want to get into long weeds of like Descartes' evil demon here, but the idea is like I believe that the material world exists. I'm not just in a brain in a vat. And you know, and so therefore it's a lot about probabilities, and that's going to be relevant to what we talk about tonight. Which quite often we have arguments that are called abductive arguments. Abductive arguments are inferences to the best explanation. That means that, you know, given this data, whatever data we're going to talk about, what is the best explanation? Is it theism or atheism?
Mhm.
So if you have these two hypotheses, and actually it's more probable that atheism is true. Now, this data doesn't prove that atheism is true, but it just favors the thesis that atheism is true. And then when you keep getting these arguments upon arguments upon arguments, and all these arguments seem to favor atheism and not theism, then you're pretty justified in believing that God does not exist. Sorry, too much talking.
No, this is good. Dude, listen, it's okay, man. We know you talk too much, but it's okay, you know. Jonathan, seriously though, man, like, tell us what this website you have is right here. Let everybody know how they can go and check you out. And I do want to play a clip before we get started, but go ahead.
Yeah. So Only Sky is a brand new media organization. I've talked about it before, but it needs to be mentioned more and more because it is the only media platform to represent and be a voice for the non-religious, for the secular community. And we are, like, I am a journalist, so I report for them and I write articles for them, and some of them are quite sort of academic stuff that I write for them, but also the general reporting on news and just news from a secular point of view. So it's really important to give a space for secular people because we're not represented, particularly in America, by any media organization explicitly. And so, you know, where Fox might represent the religious right in America, Only Sky represents the secular non-religious people. So that you can find me there. I'm one of the many excellent, well, I'm not saying I'm excellent. There are many excellent contributors there. I am one amongst many contributors.
And you are the least of all, right?
Something like that.
You're the Apostle Paul of this website. Go check it out. No, but seriously, the book we're talking about today is 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, Heaven, Hell, Satan, and Divine Design. The argument in this book, as we stated last time, for those who might misunderstand, and guarantee you with 130 people watching right now, please hit the like button. Someone's going to come in that did not hear this intro who's going to try and posit a deity that would fit somehow. You know, you can take the God and make him and mold it into your own clay if you'd like. Sure, go for it. But we're dealing with the model of an omni. And that is the whole point of this book is if you have a person who's saying all loving, all powerful, all knowing, you might as well red flag it. We got a problem with reality around us, the world we live in, and many of the arguments we're going to discuss today. We've covered the resurrection. We've talked about the nativity, which we still have to do more on. We have not delved deep into the nativity. We did one episode on that. We have more to do.
Always more.
There's always more.
Thank you to Sobek Lord of the Four Corners, who says, have the book, really enjoy it. Please, obviously, you know, it allows me to keep doing this. If you fancy something to read, or even if you don't fancy something to read, just get it anyway. But what you were saying there is really, really important. So when you have these, I'll speak to everyone else. When you have arguments against a god, it's really worth, or is absolutely vital to establish what the god is that you are arguing against, because theists have this propensity to, it's a bit like the shell game with the peas, is you attack a god and they move the cups around and yeah, but that's not the god I believe in, and then you make an argument against that god and then someone else says, well, that's not the god I believe in, and you constantly kind of trying to argue against this movable entity. And there are as many gods as there are believers, you know, essentially. So it's worth looking for the most frequent commonalities in all of these, you know, god entities that people believe in. So the most common, you know, characteristics are, as you say, the omni characteristics: omniscience, all knowing; omnipotence, all powerful; and omnibenevolence, all loving. And broadly speaking, most theists will adhere to those. Omniscience is interesting because I think the biggest problem for the God belief is the full divine foreknowledge of all future events, right? And that's something we talked about a lot in the last episode, where we talked about the first 10 arguments. That basically one of the biggest problems for any kind of God belief that has the omni characteristics is divine foreknowledge of future events, because you're kind of like, what's the point of all this? What's the point of all this suffering if you know who's going to suffer and you're going to punish them and so on and so forth? You know, it really does cause a problem.
Quick shout out for me, shameless plug. join MythVision's Patreon. I interviewed a gentleman yesterday who was in Dallas Theological Seminary. The way he was treated in church had him reevaluate everything. He also was someone who learned Greek and Hebrew and was translating the Bible into Spanish. Come to find out, he's convinced now that he was wrong, diving in and questioning everything. And of course, I've done lots of other interviews. Right now, I'm currently editing one on a guy who was in the Hare Krishna cult, and he actually talks about the murders that happened in this cult back in the 80s, 90s. JT and Lady C, Jehovah's Witnesses, I interviewed. I also interviewed a modern-day Samaritan who lives on Mount Gerizim. He is the grandson of the current high priest of the Samaritan people, which their population is less than 800 people on planet Earth. So I got a rare discussion with him. The one clip I wanted to play, if I may, just to get a teaser as well as kind of a shameless plug, but also it's in the vein of what we're doing today, is this little video that we did with Graham Oppie. And I did it with Rationality Rules and Graham Oppie. Check out this little intro.
Nice.
Let's see what we got here.
I think about idealism. I think that idealism is really counterintuitive and very hard to defend. And I'm not entirely clear that it isn't self-defeating.
A miracle that would be convincing, it said, would be God healing amputees, something that occurs regularly and we don't have a natural explanation for it, and it occurs in correlation with, say, prayer. But when it comes to miracle arguments that are nested in, as you said, prior beliefs, and also like a very long time ago, based on reports that happened lifetimes afterwards, one of the things that strikes me as unlikely is that a God would dangle salvation based on whether or not we accept that proposition under those circumstances.
Okay, there's your tease.
Nice.
It's in the vein of the discussion. Go join the Patreon right now. You can watch everything that I'm doing. There is way more content going on Patreon than YouTube. Straight up. So if you help support us, we keep this thing going.
So Rationality Rules lives fairly close to where I live, actually,
Really?
near Portsmouth in the south of the UK. And he's done stuff on the Kalam. I've got a book on the Kalam cosmological argument. Did God create the universe from nothing? Countering William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument. So at some point, I do want to interact with him on that. That's
We have to.
Yes. You have can I just say, Ray and I think Richard in the chat's already mentioned free will. We are going to be talking about free will tonight. So that's one of the arguments I am going to be bringing into play. You have a super chat already. Happy days. Okay.
So that's what I was going to ask you. I think it's necessary that as we go along, we'll take a periodic break. You're really good. You're not like some guests who don't notice. There are going to be some super chats that will accumulate throughout, and we'll find the time that's right between arguments that you're making to bring them up and go with the flow. So do we want to start with one, or do we want to go ahead and get started?
Go for it. And I want to mention something that Martin in the chat's just mentioned as well, because it's really important.
Okay. Stop scamming, man. Thank you for telling people to stop scamming. Apologists make thought experiments against infinite regress. These can be used against an omnipotent God. Can he make an infinite number of items? Could you get from one end of this line to the other?
Right. So infinities are really not problematic. Well, they can be. There are different views on infinities. And in fact, talking about the Kalam, this is really important for the Kalam. So someone like William Lane Craig would say infinities, well, he's a bit dodgy. Sometimes he says infinities are impossible. And then depends on who his audience is, and then he walks that back and says, actually, if he's talking to like philosophers and mathematicians, he say, actually, they're just, a bit metaphysically problematic. But, mathematicians will use infinities. Do infinite sets exist? I mean, it's too much to talk about now, but I mean, it just depends what your axioms are. In terms of mathematics, you have axiomatic frameworks. So you have different types of mathematics you use depend on your axiomatic frameworks. And if you have an axiom that says infinite to X, Y, and Z, then you end up with different conclusions and so on and so forth. With regards to questions like this, sometimes you get to the conclusion from theists that God has maximal capabilities. You say he can't do that which is impossible. So if you think that actual infinites are impossible, then God can't produce that in the same way that God can't produce like a square circle or whatever, or a rock that's too heavy for him to pick up or whatever. And so, you know, you get this idea of God is maximally powerful, which is, you know, to the extent that he can do things that are logically possible, so on and so forth. So I don't know that I've answered that question, because it really entails discussing infinities or infinites for about half an hour.
Yeah, just that video clip that I played too, Graham Appy. We get into the infinite rooms in the hotel argument from
Hilbert's
William
Hotel.
Lane Craig. So yeah, Hilbert's Hotel. Is that what it is? Hilbert's? Yeah. We get into that, and it's dealt with in that with Graham Appy and Rationality Rules. So if you're interested in hearing, like, you know, an explanation in depth too, you could go and check that out and hear what he has to say.
Yeah, one of the best videos to go and look into stuff like that at the moment is Skydive Phil's latest one, where he countered William Lane Craig's claims on infinities or infinites. So check out Skydive Phil Helper.
That's on YouTube?
Yeah. So Skydive Phil's videos are absolutely amazing. Check them out on YouTube. But he's done quite a big one that lots of people are talking about, because he took Craig to task on a bunch of claims to do with infinity. So if we start off where I wanted to start off today was argument 11 or chapter 11, chapter 10, sorry, from part 2, why we believe or not. Is that all right to jump into that? Actually, Martin in the chat did mention something about open theism. So it talked about the full divine knowledge of future events is a real problem for theists, and as a result, some theologians and some apologists have developed as a kind of a way of getting around the problem of full divine foreknowledge, open theism. So open theism is this idea that God doesn't have knowledge of future freely willed events. And this is an interesting way. I think if I was a Christian, I would want to believe in a God like that, because the God of full divine foreknowledge, it becomes a bit of an automaton, and it's I think it's really, really problematic, terminally so, for the whole God idea. But the problem is the God of open theism is also pretty problematic, because God has a really limited kind of knowledge, which is he's creating humanity to do all these things, but can't predict what they're going to do. And yet, like I said this to you before, we've got Facebook that can predict human behavior within 300 likes better than your own partner, right? So Facebook can create algorithms that are pretty predictive of human behavior. And the greater our knowledge we collect is, you know, in terms of big data, the more predictable humans appear to be. And so to say that God can't predict future human decisions is really limiting for God's abilities. And when we talk about things like the ontological argument, which is God is the greatest thing in human conception, you can't conceive of anything greater than that. Well, if I can conceive that a greater being is God, a God that does know future events, then that's a real problem, arguably, for open theism. And then you ask whether it's also evidence in the Bible and so on and so forth. So open theism is an interesting way to try and get around a problem, and I do see its attractiveness. I just think it comes with problems of its own.
Something that comes to mind with open theism too, that if you think hard about it, you can imagine this God, right, can't even know your future events or know the future. They can act to try and create futures or make things happen, but with limited knowledge, which makes me wonder if this is a limited knowledge being and it has no other replicate of itself. Like for us, if we didn't have any other examples of birth, we wouldn't know where we came from unless our parents told us. All right. Now imagine a deity that doesn't know and has no other example of itself to describe itself, assuming monotheism, which is a whole nother assumption late in the game, but nonetheless, let's just go with the flow. If you ask God, where did you come from? You know, if this God was honest and is probably open theism, maybe he'd say, I don't know, or something to that effect, because how could it know? if it's limited
So,
in its
yeah.
knowledge, you see what I'm trying to get at?
Well, yeah. So in the book, I give a bonus argument, 30 arguments against the existence of God, but there is a bonus, which is technically 31, which is the idea that God could exist. You know, God couldn't know, any given God couldn't know indubitably in the same way, exactly the same way that I can't. It's using Descartes' cogito ergo sum, Descartes' evil demon or the Matrix. I don't know. I'm not in the Matrix for sure.
Mhm.
God couldn't know that there isn't another God above God. So there might not be, but he can't know that there isn't, because God can't know that he himself is not a God in a vat. And so therefore that you get this, there's potentially these levels of God above God. But I throw that one in the book just for a bit of a laugh.
I saw a YouTube video where the God finds out who his God was, and then he finds out who his God is. And
see, I did this argument with Neil, and I said, look, this is one of the arguments I think is quite interesting. And he said dark matter
yes
has done that video, and I was like, oh damn it, well, that's the nature of philosophy, isn't it? Someone's always thought about these things before you.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense in the data too in the Bible, if we're going with the Bible, just because God doesn't know where they're at. You know, I shouldn't have flooded the earth. You know, oh, you didn't see that one coming, did you, buddy?
Well, no. So that flooding the earth's a bit of a problem for divine foreknowledge, because he should have knowledge of future events. The problem is the Bible's full of contradictions, right? Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, you know, prophecy makes no sense. Like, you can't be prophetic if you don't know the future events, right? So you can't make prophecies. You know, that's a bit weird. But then on the other hand, you've got God, who supposedly has divine foreknowledledge, creating humanity, realizing that they're a bit crap, and then sending a flood down to kill everyone, and then starting again. Well, that makes no sense, because God surely would have known that was going to happen, and would have designed humanity differently, surely. I mean, this is the whole problem with the flood. The flood is just a massively theologically and philosophically problematic deal, because, you know, God screws up his design, kills everyone, all the animals as well, apart from a bunch, and then starts again. It's like, what kind of OmniGod would do that?
Amen.
Anyway, where we left off from last time is we finished part one, and we're going on to part two, which is the first argument. There is the accidents of geography and history. So that's chapter 10 for anyone who particularly cares. So this argument is quite similar to was certainly talked about a lot in Jonathan's got a book called The Outsider Test for Faith, which is a really good book, actually. It's quite a simple argument, which is like, we should all treat our own, it's kind of an epistemological argument. We should all, no matter what religion we're born into, we should try and criticize our own religion as if we weren't in that religion, to still man the best arguments against it, and, you know, etc., but people don't do that. People should take themselves outside of their faith and attack it in that way. But quite a lot at the beginning of the book talks about the different data, all the data concerning like the geographical position of different religions in the world. So it turns out that, you know, if you are from Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, you're highly likely to be a Muslim. Now, where this gets interesting is that, you know, you can't control where you're born. And in fact, you generally can't control all these components that lead you to believe in whatever deity you end up believing in. And there's this geographical distribution, which we don't see in other areas of life in terms of like beliefs, like gravity, like everyone, you know, it's pretty uniform around the world, and special relativity. These things, you know, evolution's interesting. Okay, there might be some correlation with religiosity there, but in terms of like belief in God, is really geographically distributed. Now, this is a problem if you believe that there is one particular religion which is the true one. And if there's value in believing the correct one, most theists would argue there is value in believing the correct religion. Otherwise, they wouldn't go and try and and proselytize and convince people to believe their religion. If there's no value in that, then it'll be like, well, it doesn't really matter what you believe, just believe whatever, and everyone ends up in hell, some kind of universalism. Well, actually, that's not really how most religions work, which is like, you should believe my one because it's morally correct, it's the truth, and if you don't believe it, you're going to go to hell or not be rewarded in the same way as I will, and all these kind of arguments. So if you believe that there's value to the correct religion, then it's really problematic if God has set up the world such that most people are born in either in times or places where they can't access the correct religion and end up being, in the wrong religion and arguably being judged for being in the wrong religion. So the argument is that geographic distribution of believers or of religions is an argument against OmniGod because it shows that God is unfair.
Yeah, unless you swallow this horrible pill that I tried as a Calvinist, and that was simply, this was part of the plan. They weren't chosen. Like, you're trying to make sense of the data some way or the other. And I wasn't willing to sacrifice his all powerfulness for, some benevolence to try and say, oh, well, he's struggling with man. He's trying, at least at the end.
So I think that your point there, the trying to explain the data is hugely important. So the notion of everything I'm talking about is the underlying issue in belief in an OmniGod is that every single bit of data needs to be explained in that framework. Now, with the naturalistic framework, right, I don't need to explain. Like, there's no need for me to explain why there are different groups of religious believers in different areas of the world, right? I can explain that. And in fact, naturalism explains it perfectly well, right? But I don't need to. There's no kind of like burning need for me because it's unfair in some kind of way. That's just how it is. But for the theist who believes in OmniGod, you have to explain all data in light of an all-loving God. So therefore, all the distribution of people and religions has to be explained in light of the fact that God is all loving. So how does that work? And you did it in your Calvinist way, which is, one theological way to do that. But, other people, so for example, William Lane Craig tries to explain this by saying, and I've talked to you about this before, that the souls of people who never get access to God, either geographically or historically. So an Amazonian tribesperson living in 5000 BC is never going to have read the Bible, right? Because it hasn't existed. It's not going to get God's true revelation, Jesus' atonement, and all this kind of stuff. So how does William Lane Craig explain that? Well, he says that the souls of those people, God knew would freely reject God, right? And the key there is freely reject them. So God then front loads those souls into all the people that aren't going to access God's love or God's revelation. And you're like, what?
It is rubbish, man. Like, this is what did it for me. I used to follow William Lane Craig. I came to his position. I was actually in a position before his position with Ravi Zacharias and people like him. And I believed God loved everybody. And when I actually faced a Calvinist, because you're working within the same framework. So like, if you're facing text of the scripture and you're going head on with them, like there's some real, if you're being honest, like I was, pills I had to swallow, right? You already have this anachronistic OmniGod. And I said anachronistic for a reason, because today we now know what the hell is going on. See Francesca Stavrakopoulou's book to get an idea. Same color. I'm in the UK too, man.
Yeah, mate, the American cover is rubbish. And she said that herself. And I had to say the British cover is beautiful.
It is.
Carry on.
Anyway, like I noticed the one big problem, God knows everything. And I always thought that, right? As a Christian, God knows the future, but he didn't cause all things to happen. That's the Calvinist kind of conclusion, whether you're infra or super lapsarian. I was super at the end. But point is, God caused the future is what they're trying to say. And I'm like, no, he didn't. And this tough question of like, he knew everything that was going to happen. Why did he put him in a garden with the fruit next to a serpent that he knew was going to come up, that was going to do this? Like, so notice right off the bat, there's a contradiction to Adam, where are you? And they want to justify this. Where are you? Is like, God knew where he was. No, the text does not say God knew where he was. The text says, where are you? I don't know where you're at. I need to know where you're at. because he didn't know where he was. That's the straightforward meaning of the text. So I already had an omni understanding of something that really is an omni to begin with. But nonetheless, I'm reading it this way and I'm going, well, if he knew all of this, he had to have this as part of the plan. That's when Calvinism started to become tempting and made more sense, because you deal with the beginning and then you go back to Paul's letters and you're like, hold on, what's going on? But like I said, I struggled with benevolence and his all-powerfulness being an issue.
And this is quite common. What you do is theists will solve one area of problem, but that causes more problems over here. So then they look for a solution over here, and that causes a problem over here. And then they look for a solution over there. And what happens eventually, those solutions are mutually exclusive. So at some point, that solution contradicts the solution they gave over here, but they've forgotten that they gave that solution over here because it was in a different context, a different argument with a different person. And you just get this mess of theology. And this, when you talk about what you were talking about, and we talked about this in the last video, but about the Adam and Eve problems and the dilemma horns, go and check that video out, because we treat the Adam and Eve problem, pretty well there. But you get this idea that God is anthropomorphized, and again, Francesca will talk about that. I would say her surname, but I'll get it wrong. And what you see is God not knowing where Adam is in the Garden of Eden. But of course, that's probably just the writers at the time and their understanding and anthropomorphizing God. But the question is that accurate? And if you believe all these stories are fully accurate, then you've got a problem, because you've clearly got a mishmash of different genres, styles, authors, claims, theologies going on right throughout the Bible. It's not a single narrative. It's and that's why you get these messes that then people have to pick up 2,000 years later, saying, well, how do I work that out with omnipotence and omnibenevolence, etc., etc.?
Let me ask you one question, because I'm not a philosophy guru, but you really know your philosophy. When William Lane Craig's making up this, well, see, what happens is there are souls that God knows beforehand, and he inserts the souls in those particular people that he knows would freely reject him. It sounds like this guy is looking for any possible philosophical way to rationalize all of this stuff within his omni position.
God, yeah.
But it's the most ad hoc proposition to make.
But that's the only way it can be. So, it's fighting fire. It's the firefighting over here and then over here. And you're like, well, oh my goodness, how can I explain this? So, you posit something like the soul, which is itself completely nonsensical. But yeah, I mean, these are... I like Richard Carrier's phrase, possibiliter ergo probabiliter. So it's a logical fallacy, I would say, that it's possible, therefore it's probable. And you see this all the time from theists, which is, I've come up with a possible answer to this, and it could conceivably get you out of this hole. Therefore, that's probably what did happen. Therefore, that is what happened.
Do
you know what I mean?
Starting with the answer, though. That's the thing about the apologist and the dishonesty of this approach, is it's starting with the answer of, we know that God is true. We know that this is real. We know these are his attributes. Therefore, based on all these no's, we must fit how this all can work within a possible philosophical framework where God's off the hook. Yeah. All humans are responsible for being born and everything that ends up happening. I mean, like everybody ends up in trouble that doesn't believe, and so they find a way.
Yeah, this is a problem of starting off with a conclusion or an axiom that is just unjustified, which is like, I'm starting off that God is perfect, right? And Jesus is perfect, and then I'm going to historically analyze Jesus, and then I'm going to do a whole load of biblical exegesis with the axiom, not the conclusion, the axiom that Jesus and or God are perfect. And then I'm going to have a look at how slavery works in the Bible, and therefore I'm going to make up some kind of way that fits the data to this axiom that God is perfect. And it's like, I would say that biblical exegesis is just morally bankrupt. It's methodologically bankrupt, even more so. But what happens is you end up, trying to justify slavery and genocide and all these things. and we'll come on to this a bit later, because the idea of theodicies, the idea of why is there so much suffering in the world, and presenting defenses of that, which is a theologian's job, is arguably itself morally bad, because what you're trying to do is essentially morally justify genocide. Imagine if I sat down, right, and said, right, how can I morally justify the Holocaust? You know, let's look at the Holocaust and the murder of all the Jews in concentration camps, right? That has to be good. So how can I, like, imagine like how you'd be treated? Like, what are you doing? Why are you trying to? But this is what theists have to do. If you're starting with the axiom that God is morally perfect, and there's like countenanced genocide, slavery, and rape in the Bible, you get theology.
Yep. You broke up for a second. I thought you were still talking and it froze, but no, yeah, you're right. 100%. The paths we take, I could go on and on about this and just pointing out how we would try to make this work in a Calvinist world. But that's when it becomes not only contradictory, I would say it became contradictory to my own experience. Because what ended up happening to me, Jonathan, at one point, as I realized I love people more than God. Like, God actually hates some of the people that I actually love. And I couldn't worship a God that I knew hated people probably that I loved. Because some of these people rejected Christ. They didn't believe, but they were my friends and I loved them. And some of them are my family. That stuff really got me thinking, okay, hold up. What?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And I think the idea, so going back to the geographical distribution of believers, like, again, it's the abductive argument here. So what does this better support? The idea of atheism, theism. If it's theism, you have to kind of explain weirdly how this, and hence the William Lane Craig soul argument. And I'll read you that I quote in the book a Christian apologist who, a guy called Tim Stratton, who just basically uses Craig's argument here. Quote, God knew that those who never hear the gospel would freely choose to reject it, even if they did hear it. Remember that God has perfect omniscience. Therefore, he knows with certainty who would freely accept his offer of love and who would freely choose to reject him, even if they could do otherwise. It makes you question why he would create them then. Why create these souls that he knows are going to reject him? You're creating souls such that they will reject you, and then you're going to punish them for that. Like, what? Anyway, and we talked about it in the last one. Since God knows who will freely choose to reject him, even though they really could do otherwise, problem. Why does God even need to let them hear the gospel, since he knows they would reject it anyway? I can imagine the unevangelized person face to face with Jesus on Judgment Day. The person might initially object and say, but this isn't fair. How could I have rejected you when I didn't even know about you? God would reply, I knew that even if you were face to face with me on earth, you would have rejected me anyway. The defendant would then reply, that's right. I would have rejected you then, and I reject you now. How convenient. God can make sure that those who would repent if they hear the gospel message will hear the gospel message. As an advocate of God's middle knowledge, I believe that God knows with perfect certainty who would repent after hearing about Jesus. Therefore, if hearing the gospel is necessary to be saved, God can make sure that those he knows would accept him will be born in a time and a place in which they will hear the gospel. It's exactly what I was saying.
Do you know what this sounds like to me, Jonathan? This sounds like the Gnostic idea that only some have the spark. You know, God, the shattering of the spark of God that goes into only some of the elect. And this is, in a way, kind of a Calvinistic-ish type of thing. It's another form of it, but a much more get God off the hook. Instead of God pushing you, like, instead of God being the one pushing you off the cliff, he hires his henchmen to push you off the cliff. Therefore, God's not guilty. It's that idea that, you know, Christians will say God is not the author of confusion and he doesn't lie and this and that. But then you see passages where he's like, hey, which spirit will go and tell a lie for me? And it's like, hold on, you don't lie. Well, God doesn't lie, but he sent a spirit to lie. Oh, so God can have spirits go lie on his behalf, but God doesn't lie, even though he's the one causing a lie to go to these people to mislead them. It just goes back to that. I don't know. I'm thinking of that spark thing and how they're trying to make this argument that they wouldn't have accepted. You wouldn't have accepted even if, well, it's almost like you weren't elect. It's why Calvinists come to that conclusion. You see what I'm trying to say?
The job of the theologian is to get God off the hook, right? So it's like if if we can, we have to get God off the hook. So therefore, it's got to be humans' fault in some way. Like, we can't blame a rock because that's weird. Humans have to be responsible for their own the own seeming unfairness, right? Humans have to somehow be to blame. Then you start getting, this is where the theodicies come in, and to try and explain how it could be so seemingly unfair and why there's so much suffering, etc., etc.
Let me get these super chats.
Yep, do it.
All right. Thank you for the super chats, my friends. Chendi, thank you so much for that 10.
He's a legend. He's such a great supporter of my own channel. So
awesome. Great discussion. I have not finished your book, Jonathan. You ask very good questions. Love the challenges to us theists. I acknowledge the questions you ask are very difficult to answer.
Yeah, and that's what I love about Chindi. He comes on quite often to my videos and expresses the fact that he is a theist, and these are genuinely difficult questions to answer, and therefore, you know, faith plays a huge part in why he believes what he does, etc., etc. And brilliant. You know, you're being honest with yourself. Yeah.
Keep it up, Chendi, and thank you for the super chat, the support, and showing love and respect on the opposite side of the aisle. But I think we're all on the same path of this thing we call life and trying to figure out the world around us. So thank you for being another human being and showing love and stuff, and just keep going. Keep going. Don't give up. Jake K, thank you for the super chat. Imagine today believing in angels and spirits. Imagine in this day rationalizing ancient myth. Augustine wrote on the origin of the soul. Well, obviously you can't just dismiss the soul. Laugh out loud.
Well, so we're not going to be getting onto the soul in this one because that comes in some of the arguments later, and we're already, 41 minutes, and we've only done one argument.
Hey, this is what we do, man. I like
great,
you so much that I want to milk you till you're like, okay, hold on.
Jesus,
we can't finish today. I got to come back 5 more times, okay?
We had visions of me being milked by you, but there you go.
Listen. I didn't mean it like that, okay? You pervert. Thank you so much, Jake, for the super chat. Did you want to comment on this, though?
So this is interesting. You know, the further we get on, so I've been feeling this a lot lately, which is I'm starting to think how absolutely ridiculous, say, for example, Christianity is, and some of the beliefs involved in that, and like cannibalism of like transubstantiation, or the Matthew zombies parading around Jerusalem, or the souls or angels or people living to 930 years old, and like the Exodus and the Egyptian, like the horrible 10 plagues, just all the stuff is so I'm beginning to think, God, trying to rationalize that, it's just you're on hiding to nothing. This is obviously ridiculous, and yet, you know, here we have a huge proportion of the world's population is still attempting to rationalize this, and it beggars belief, but there you go.
Well, that is the father of Calvinism, or John Calvin's ideology. Augustine, his daddy. His daddy came up with that idea: single, double predestination. Whatever position you want to try and take. I thought he was a double predestinarian, that's in-group theological disputes on single and double, and really it's about, did God really cause everything, including the fall, which would mean he's the author of evil? And there's very few Calvinists who will just accept what it is. They like to pretend it's not. But I think Augustine, he had that funny prayer where he's like, God is like something like he prays for something, but he goes, but if it be thy will, like line my will with what you already are going to cause. And I wonder if he got influenced philosophically from Manichaeanism, and if that
because he was beforehand, wasn't he?
Yeah, that predetermined fate idea. I wonder if that influenced his Christian theology. I don't know, because he was a Manichaean, so.
And it's interesting. Yeah, some conversation going on in the live chat. Someone saying, debunking Christianity or other religion is pointless, people will still believe. And then James Appleton comes back and says, actually, Dark Matter 2525, debunking the Great Flood, led to my deconversion. So it does matter. I suppose the question for me is always, well, what led you to watch Dark Matter 2525? You know, what sows those seeds that you're watching? But yeah, hopefully these kind of conversations do generate seeds of doubt for people that you know, with enough nurturing and fertile ground, become full-on skeptical, you know, beliefs.
Comfortably land the plane. Apollos, thank you for the super chat. Driving out, but I divide moral and complete causality. People are morally faultless for breathing out oxygen. Hitler breathes, though Genesis is a joke. NGL. What's NGL mean?
I don't know, but I don't know.
Not gonna lie. Not gonna lie.
Right, yeah. Yeah,
I'm getting clever with those young people's, you know.
So I don't know if this is like leading into free will, talk of causality here, and complete causality, moral you know, we're going to come on to free will and whether you can morally judge someone in the absence of free will. So that might be what Apollos is talking about, but I don't know.
Thank you so much. Sorry for having to keep Jonathan on for 10 more episodes just to get through 10 more arguments.
So the next chapter is building on that previous one about unfair distribution of you know, beliefs, if you like, and how does that work with an omnibenevolent God. This one is about unfair levels of evidence. And you only have to think about Thomas, doubting Thomas. He gets to doubt, you know, he knew Jesus, right? He's been with Jesus doing all these incredible, you know, miracles and supposedly, and Thomas is there in amongst it. And Jesus comes back to life, there in front of him, and he doesn't believe, right? And so Jesus says, well, you know, touch my holy hands or whatever. And so eventually Thomas goes, oh, brilliant. I get to touch you, Jesus. Now I believe. And he's now a saint in heaven or whatever. But the point is that he's been afforded something like 95% evidence level, right? And there's me, like 2,000 years later, being told to believe this book that has really dodgy provenance. So I'm basically given 5% of evidence level.
See, but William Lane Craig will say, God knew when he created you that if he stuck you inside this particular soul, that you would freely deny it, even if he gave you 95% of evidence. So therefore, you see how ridiculous.
But if he knew that in advance, why is he creating me to do that in such a way that I then get punished for it? You know, there's no way out of this. The divine foreknowledge is a real problem. It's like, yeah, but I knew you were going to reject me. Yeah, but if you knew I was going to reject you before you created me, and you created me anyway, like, you know, I'm not the one that created myself. Like, if you knew I was going to reject you and you've created me such that I rejected you, and then you're going to punish me on account of me rejecting you, you have to take ultimate responsibility for that.
Yeah, you would think that's the case. And, you know, this touches divine hiddenness too. I mean, this, but we're not going down the path, I guess. Well, whenever
we are actually. So it's one of the arguments later.
I mean, it is absolutely. And you're supposed to look around the world, as Paul says, just look around, right? In those days, you wouldn't have known how some of this stuff is a natural cause for why these things are. But you're supposed to look around and just notice that based on the creation, you can know the creator, you know. That doesn't work so well anymore now that we know more than we did. You know, some people are just hook, line, and sinker looking for. There has to be something that made all of this, you know, but.
Yeah, so what you get these different combinations of beliefs. So some people are looking for belief, right? And they're like, I'm really susceptible to belief. So it's like, I believe like 99% in Jesus, and I'm a really committed believer, but I was only given 15% evidence. But I jumped on it. Whereas like someone else, like Thomas, had to be given 95% evidence before he believed, and then I'm given 5% evidence and I don't believe, and then some. So, but then someone who's given more evidence might end up believing less, and someone that's given less evidence believing more. And so it's just this really weird combination, not weird, just a really like vastly varied distribution of evidence and believability and belief. And what explains that? And what does God do with that? So does God just reward everyone that gets over a certain point, or is there some really complex matrix of evaluation where he says, well, you were only given this percentage of evidence, but you believe this much, so that equates to this? He's like some mathematical equation where he's taking into account all the variables, and it pumps out a number, and he goes, and so you're going to hell and you're going to heaven. And it's like, okay,
and
brilliant.
You get hell, and you get hell, and you get hell.
Yeah.
Oprah Winfrey's hanging out with God right now.
There you go. And I came up with an analogy to hopefully kind of explain this. So, excuse me as I read out. Imagine I have a class of 30 children to whom I give a test. All 30 children have different brains, knowledge bases, abilities, and thresholds, etc. I give them a test of 100 questions and declare that the children who fail to get 70 out of 100 will get detention. That's hell. Children who get 70 will get a special treat. It's heaven. I then give them the test, except I also give out different cheat sheets to everyone, ranging from 0 points of help to 95 points. Each child either gets no extra help or gets some kind of leg up to getting close to that 70-point success. Some people, like little Thomas, get a cheat sheet with answers worth 95 points. Lucky him. Poor Alice, who is not very clever due to her genetics and troublesome environment, gets a cheat sheet worth 0 points of help and gets 16 out of 100 and detention. We could actually make this more accurate. Some children are given trickster cheat sheets, like our Saudi student, Mo, who gets a sheet that actually tells him the wrong answers and leaves him with 35 points less than he would have got on his own. He gets 50 and receives a detention. Perhaps as a teacher, I actually take in the answers, but don't announce to anyone the results until the end of the school day. In the meantime, I plug their results into a matrix that calculates an outcome based on 1, abilities, 2, environment, 3, cheat sheets, and 4, their results. I then use these calculated results to enforce on them a detention or a reward. So on and so forth. And you can add to that, the idea that you could punish people during the test by cattle prodding them and all the things that happen in real life while we're giving these tests and the suffering. But the extra problem, of course, is that as a teacher, the reason I test people is that I don't know what their knowledge is. So I test them to inform me. But I don't really understand why God is testing all of humanity. If God knows all the answers in advance, all the test results of the human students, of the human subjects, what's the point? So, if it's all about going to heaven and hell in the end, and God already knows who's going to go to heaven and who's going to hell, just create heaven and just throw the people into heaven that you knew in advance were going to pass the test and be done with it. Job done. Don't bother creating this test environment where we all suffer and then most of us end up going to hell anyway, if that's what, that's kind of what you believe.
Really funny part is there are cheat sheets with the wrong answers, and this is like every other religion pretty much. So now every person who's in another religion who does not get these answers correct and knows the correct answer to this test, and they're given wrong answers, they're screwed. You kind of wonder who has a better chance, the person without any cheat sheet at all trying to make a guess, or the people who have wrong cheat sheets who were born taught by their other teachers, let's say, who taught them certain things. Hey, when you go take that test, don't worry, you're going to ace it. Just make sure you mention Muhammad, okay? Make sure you mention Krishna. Hey, make sure you mention Buddha. Make sure you mention whoever it might be. Poor people, you're going to hell. I'm sorry. Wrong answer.
Brad Kemble at the side says, what an ignorant view. I would always just say to that, citation required, and substantiate that one. So I think the analogy works pretty well. And what I was in a prolonged argument when I used to write at Patheos, non-religious. before we were cancelled by evangelical Christians. But that's another story.
Wow.
So I used to argue with a Catholic apologist called Dave Armstrong, and he said, "But everyone's been given sufficient evidence." And so I want to just explain this a little bit because it's worth dwelling on a bit, because this is a really common argument that Christians will give. And this idea that he and I had sufficient evidence, what he means by that is I was given the same evidence as he was, but he believes, therefore it's sufficient to believe. As in, everyone operates on his metrics, and with like his threshold is sufficient evidence. And the analogy I give to that is like, that's like saying 5 litres of petrol, of gas, is sufficient gas to get you from here to Portsmouth, right? And you're like, okay, if you're driving my Vauxhall out the front, then yeah, £5 will get you there. But if I've got a Humvee out the front, £5 ain't going to get you there. 5 litres of petrol ain't going to get you there. And if I've got my Vauxhall out there, but it's got a hole in the fuel tank, then 5 litres ain't going to get you there either. And if I've got a bicycle, 5 litres ain't going to get you there. So in other words, what is sufficient is context dependent. And when you're talking about sufficient evidence for a believer, it depends on your brain, upon your circumstances, upon your environment, right? So what is sufficient evidence for me to believe in Christianity is going to be very different to what is sufficient evidence for Dave Armstrong as a Catholic apologist who's been born and brought up, in a religious, environment. And so you can't just say, well, we've all got the same access to the same data, so therefore that is sufficient evidence to believe. In the same way that you could say a conspiracy theorist has sufficient evidence to believe that the moon landing was a load of rubbish and it was faked. It's like, yeah, but that amount of evidence you've got there is not good enough. It's not sufficient for this woman over here whose father was a NASA scientist who worked on the moon landings. She's born and brought up and blah, 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 and knows all this and X, Y, and Z. That's not sufficient for her to believe. So don't assume that sufficiency for you is sufficiency for everyone else. Don't project your situation on everyone else. Anyway, I think that's important to say.
Yeah, Odin Allfarther had an interesting comment. It's more akin to starting from a different place.
Yeah.
Too. So it's like another analogy, same thing being said. You're starting from a different place and each is given the same amount of fuel, supposedly. How are we going to get to the same conclusions? We're not, especially if we're starting in different areas. And the interesting thing is, as I played that clip at the beginning with Graham Oppie and Rationality Rules, my friend Steven, like the point is like you're already in this bed of belief, and a lot of people are already born into this. They're already starting with a head start in the conclusion that they're already going in. If that conclusion is wrong, they wouldn't be able to notice it. They've already been like nested inside of this, view to the point where they can't see outside of the view or understand why someone who's on the outside gets it. That's why when the light switch began to change for me, it's hard to describe to people who are in the bubble, who've never experienced what it's like to actually be a skeptic, to actually say, I don't believe. I never dreamed I would ever say these words. I mean it. I did not think it was possible. I thought demons were in everything. People were possessed. There were spirits everywhere. Pokemon cards were even like possessed with, I was on the full spectrum of ridiculous, wishful, superstitious thinking. Step on a crack, you really might break your mother's back. And I actually would think like there's power in words to the point where if I stepped on it or if I thought it, I could actually cause it in reality, which there's a lot of reasons in the natural world to explain why we think this way. But I just want to mention how crazy I was for everybody to understand,
No, I've written before articles and actually some of my chapters in some of my books. Why do normal people believe ridiculous things? And it's this idea that, why do you believe those crazy things? Why does someone believe that the global flood is even remotely possible and plausible and actually happened? And so there, everyone comes at these things with different backgrounds, and if you're born and brought up and you're told these things at the age of 2, 3, 4, 5 before you learn what's plausible and implausible, then these things get embedded in your mind, in your consciousness, in your psyche, and you don't question them in the same way that you question new facts that you learn when you're 20 or new claims that you learn when you're 20. It's like, well, that's obviously ridiculous, but you've got embedded in here stuff that's bypassed that veto system. Obviously with you is different, like you were learning these things as you were getting older, but it's just like once you're in that kind of cult, if you like, or once you're in that sort of worldview and with those people, you're drawn along with it, and these things get added on, and each subsequent thing isn't so crazy and implausible because you've already got a whole bunch of crazy things in there.
That's true. I mean, I already said crazy stuff. I recorded myself one time saying, if the Bible says that Jonah swallowed a whale, I would believe it. I went on record recording, if Jonah swallowed a whale, not if he got swallowed by a whale.
Yeah.
And I was just like, if the Bible says that, that's the most ridiculous thing you could even try to imagine. And obviously it doesn't say that, but I was like, if it did, I would believe it. That's how naive. William Arnn says, Jesus says, Matthew 18:3, that the elect must be like faithful, humble children rather than wise theologians and apologists, thus faith-based ignorance.
I mean, that's your kettle of fish there, isn't it, with regard to Calvinism and the elect?
Yeah, it's hard to know where the text of the Gospels is going to Jews, or when this is dealing with people who are non-Jews as well, because obviously Israel would be an elect nation, chosen people. But then those terms start getting hijacked and used for the Christ movement. So you kind of wonder, is this talking about Christians or not? But the idea that they should be humble and like children, kind of naive and just accept what you're told and don't really challenge or anything like that. I think that's what he's trying to get at, I do.
This idea that, and you see some of them are memes, and you wonder how reliable they are. But these pictures of notice boards outside the churches in America, which is like saying things like, "Don't send your kids to university" or whatever, or like education, beware of education. The idea that being wise and being clued up is a real threat to faith and belief and religion. I would argue, yes, it's true, but how ridiculous it is to argue that you shouldn't get greater education, greater wisdom, and greater understanding because you might be tempted not to believe. It's just a real anti-intellectual position that I have a real problem with.
Thank you for that super chat, William. Appreciate the support, my friend.
So the next argument, moving on to chapter 12th argument. And this is, again, we're talking about God being unfair given these kind of distributions. We're talking about evidence, causal circumstances to belief and all sorts of things. So this one is, some people are still more likely to believe than others, and that's also unfair. So this is the idea that certain autistic people, for example, are less likely to believe in God than neurotypical people. Men are less likely to believe in God than women. And there are other different we can talk about any kind of subset of people. It really doesn't matter. And actually, it doesn't matter why they're less likely to believe. It really doesn't. So the point is here is that if you're born into being in that subset of people, certain types of autism, men, you are less likely to believe, which means that's a bit unfair. Because if that's if there's a value to this belief, like I said earlier, if it's really important that we do believe in God, because then we enter into a loving relationship, and faith is important for being rewarded with heaven, and lack of faith is important for being punished with hell, then this is really unfair. And there's interesting data. I mean, you could look at, as I say, so autism is a really wide, massive umbrella of different sort of behaviors and characteristics, and I don't want to stigmatize at all. I've got a child who's autistic myself, but there's interesting data to suggest that for certain autistic people, there is an inability to do intersubjectivity, which is empathy, which is putting myself in someone else's shoes. And the idea is that this creates a sort of mentalizing deficit, is the term. The idea is that they can't, if you struggle to imagine you are someone else, that's really problematic for belief in a personal God, because people who believe in a personal God are always generally thinking, what does God think about me? So I've done this thing, and it's the whole kind of guilt and you know, whatever. And the idea that I've done this thing, oh my goodness, is God watching? What does God think about what I've done? Now, if you're unable to do that into subjectivity, then that whole process doesn't happen, and therefore you're not really bothered about what God. And so therefore people end up, you know, they're less likely to believe in a personal deity. And if that's the case, God is unfair. So if God's setting up this world and designed this world in such a way that certain people are less likely to believe in God than others, then God is unfair.
I like the way you put that, because I did care what God thought. In fact, it always worried me how I was disappointing or letting God down. And then eventually when I became a Calvinist, this is where it got really weird. I, as a human, still always felt, you know, nothing about me technically changed when I changed my thoughts about what God was. Because when you become a Calvinist, God gets way more, how do you put this? If we're dealing with nature, alpha, God becomes so alpha, you know, like mighty, to the point where it's like, you know, you need to shut your mouth, you human, you know. And I started to fit myself in going, why am I having problems with drug addiction? And I started to really think, am I really God's chosen? You know, he talks about being elect, and his spirit being in you would cause you to be able to live this holy life. I was reading Paul, I was reading all these things, and I'm going, am I God's chosen? Then I'd come back to the faith and I'd be good when I wouldn't relapse. When I'd relapse, my mind would change again. You know, chemicals and such would make me chase the drug. But while I was, you know, in this emotional state of Christianity, evangelical Christianity, if I didn't have that worried about what God was thinking about me, I don't even know if I would even be thinking about God.
Well, that's
God even existed. You know,
there's a great 2012 paper by Nuran Zion and Will Gervais, who's written some brilliant papers on psychology of religion. The paper is called "Mentalizing Deficits Constrain Belief in a Personal God," and I'm just going to quote from that just to back up a little bit of what I was saying. Partway in the paper, it says, religious believers intuitively conceptualize deities as intentional agents with mental states, this is theory of mind stuff, who anticipate and respond to human beliefs, desires, and concerns. It follows that mentalizing deficits, so if you're unable to do that, associated with the autistic spectrum and also commonly found in men more than in women, may undermine this intuitive support and reduce belief in a personal God. And later they say, finally, the prevalence and content of supernatural agent beliefs, although constrained by core social cognitive capacities. So that what they're saying is that even though you might have these mentalizing deficits, your brain is just not very good at being able to deal with that. They respond to and fluctuate with socio-demographic conditions across time and cultures. Within this broader theoretical landscape, these studies present new evidence for a social cognitive mechanism underlying one source of individual differences in religious belief. Now, that's a lot of whatever. To unpick that, let's just say people have mentalizing deficits that mean you're less likely to believe in God because you've got the structures that are in place, but there are also loads of socio-economic variables as well. And it's just really complicated. So believing, whether you believe or not, is going to be a function of your brain, and it's like the whole free will debate is a function of who you are and your biology, genetics, and you know, biology including your brain, but also your environment, your socioeconomic pressures, and so on and so forth. These things are outside of your control. And yet you're being judged on whether you believe or not. You know, if you're a certain autistic person who finds it really difficult to empathize and do the intersubjectivity, then you're much less likely to believe in a personal God. So do you end up being punished in hell for that? And if you're not, then it doesn't really matter whether you do believe or not. Like, it's okay not to believe. So this is a real problem, and it just shows either God is unfair or it doesn't really matter what you believe.
This is a really interesting point you bring up. It makes me once again get to the point of people who usually believe in this OmniGod through Christianity, for example, or I would also argue it through Islam, you name it, feel like they need it to be saved. They need it to be saved from something. If you didn't feel like you needed to be saved from something, what do you need salvation from? If you're not empathizing with the need of something like that, then what is the point? And I imagine there's a blessing to that as well. Being autistic might even be a blessing in that respect, because you're like, you know, what people think or whatnot doesn't really matter to you like it would to us who care about what people think and how we feel about ourselves. And all of that internal voice and thinking plays a role in why we believe in things. I even heard it once. Didn't Steven Pinker say something like, maybe it was Steven Pinker, one of the people who are like the leading scientists on language, the first time man was speaking and they heard in their head their own voice talking, you know, you could talk to yourself in your head, and they thought, God? Because, like, how do you explain that voice that's inside? I'm just saying, as an example, that inner voice makes you kind of wonder if there's an easy perception, a small leap from that to a God, and that's it.
I just remember when one of my twin boys, they just learned about God, I think, at school, and you know, he came back and said, "What do you believe in God, Dad?" And I was like, okay, so I want to be really careful because I don't want to teach my kids the conclusion. I want to teach them the mechanisms and the critical thinking to make their own conclusions. And as long as their conclusions are justified by, you know, their rationalizations, then that's fine by me. Well, as long as they're not murdering innocent people or whatever. Anyway, I'm going off on one. So anyway, my kid got back and said, you know, do you believe in God? And I said, no. But I don't, and I started trying to say, but I don't want you to not believe in God just because I don't. But he cut me off in the middle of my sentence and said, yeah, but I just want to believe what you believe. And this is really interesting because, you know, I could have been someone who said, yes, and I want you to believe what I believe too. And I indoctrinated him there. But I say, no, actually, I don't want you to believe what I believe just because I believe it. But here is what evolutionary pressures have done, is create a brain in children that is very impressionable because it's a shortcut to knowledge and truth in other contexts. Like, so if I was to say, say to my son, don't eat these red berries here because they're going to poison you and you will die, then he's better off believing me, because the only other way is to test those berries, and then by testing them, if he dies, then that's not a very, so you might as well believe me. It's a shortcut to that kind of truth, right? But it misfires. This kind of mechanism misfires because then I say God's true, God is true, and the flood happened, and my kid goes, yes, I believe that just as strongly as I do what you said about the berries. Then we've got an indoctrinated child. Now, if I told my 6-year-old child, I don't believe in God, you shouldn't believe in God, then that starts a ball rolling for him, right? Imagine then 20 years later, he doesn't believe in God because I put these variables in place for him early doors. Does he get punished on account of that non-belief when really I'm the causal influence in why he doesn't believe? And so this whole idea of being rewarded or punished for faith and is ridiculous, because you are the product of who you are with all the experience you've ever had, and at any given point in time you don't have control over those things that have already been and gone. Anyway, sorry.
That was so well put. I'm not even going to add anything to it other than I don't teach my kids what to believe. If they ask questions because they overhear me in conversations with people, I'm open and honest with them and tell them why I think the way I do. One of my kids, I think, does think there's something. My wife thinks there's something out there. She doesn't know what it is, but she thinks there is something. I don't. She doesn't think aliens. But Ricky Johnson, thank you for the super chat. And he's a member of MythVision's YouTube channel, man. Thank you so much for joining. I idolize Jonathan. Absolutely brilliant. You could send him the check afterwards, Jonathan.
He's a good supporter of my channel as well. So thank you so much, Ricky.
Will I be punished for worshiping him? MythVision rocks.
The simple answer is not by God, but they're someone else. I think, Derek might punish you for not worshiping Derek. So, but thank you, Ricky. That's really, really, really kind.
Yeah. That's a fact, Ricky. That's a fact. I will punish you in the post-mortem if you don't at least light a candle for me once in your lifetime. At least once. But I'm at least decent. I don't expect you to devout your life or to not go on sinning. I'm a much, much kinder God So yes, we can work that out, my friend. Doc Pluromanath in the house. Thank you for the super chat. And what of the enigma of Dr. Ramachandran's split brain patient who became, what is that? Later lateralized for theism?
So, I mean, I don't know of this case, but I'm imagining what you've got is someone who's got a particular brain situation who then that is causally responsible for leading to this person's belief. And we're going to get onto the kind of free will debate here, but it's the idea that this is what led to their belief. Well, do they have responsibility over choosing that? Well, then how is it fair that they are rewarded with heaven, you know, when this has been, you know, a result of things that are not strictly within their control?
Thank you so much.
A bit like all these other things we're talking about, which is where you're born, what your parents are saying and doing, and etc. Yeah, it's just unfair, the amount of evidence you are presented with.
Appreciate that, Doc. And we also have another one from Stop Scamming Man. Can God make 2 + 2 = 5? If not, is it because it's mathematically impossible? If so, where does this inhibition stop? Doesn't biology boil down to chemistry, chemistry to physics, physics to math?
So this, wow, okay. Whew. Right, you can talk about the moral argument here, or you can talk about the age-old dilemma, Euthyphro dilemma about, or Euthyphro, about, you know, is something good because God says it's good, or is it good independent of what God says? And that's really interesting and as yet actually pretty much unanswered problem in the moral domain. And it's also pertinent to this question, which is one of logic or mathematics here, which is to say, you know, is God being logical because God created logic and therefore it's just a function of God, or is it independent of God? And is it like some kind of axiom of all realities? Is it like necessary? And if it is part of God, is it a necessary? You know, we can get onto all kind of arguments here about what is the nature of logic ontologically, and could God change logic such that you know, he can make a square circle, or 2 + 2 = 5, you know, and the answer is no, because God doesn't exist. So the point's moot. But you know, these are interesting questions for theologians to wrangle with.
Or that silly one, can God make a rock so heavy he can't lift?
Yeah.
Silly stuff like,
yeah.
Thank you,
Exactly.
Stop Skimming Man. Appreciate that super chat, my friend.
So we're moving on to the section part 3, which is the moral life. So we're going to talk about morality, and this is where I would say things like the moral argument for me just doesn't work, which is, I mean, there's so much, we could spend hours and hours and hours just talking about morality. So I need to be concise here. The moral argument is, if God does not exist, objective moral facts do not exist. Objective moral facts and duties do exist, therefore God does exist. So you hear William Lane Craig and all sorts of apologists use this as an absolute favorite. And it's like, you know, murdering babies is obviously objectively bad. And therefore, you know, anyone that disagrees with that needs a head check. So therefore, objective moral facts definitely exist. It's like, okay, right, where do we start here? Objective moral facts do not exist because objective abstract ideas do not exist, right? And this is where I need to really quickly set out my ontological starting position, because actually it then informs everything else further up. I mean, I wrote this. If you really want to know, please grab this book. If you're in Britain, this is on offer on UK paperback on Amazon. This is Why I Am Atheist and Not Atheist: How to Do Knowledge, Meaning, and Morality in a Godless World. And this is where I start talking about ontology down here, moving up to epistemology, natural theology, teleology, and into you know, morality at the end. So that's hopefully you would find that a really good book. Now, what is it I want to say? I am what's called a conceptual nominalist. What is that bit of jargon? a conceptual nominalist is someone who believes that abstract ideas do not exist outside of our brains. So, for example, if I was to ask you what, so Derek, give me an example of a hero. Who's a hero to you?
My father.
Okay.
I wrote my senior project on my father. So
your father's a hero to you. Someone else might say Mother Teresa. Someone else might say, I don't know, Alexander the Great. Someone else might say their favorite like football player, whatever, right? And we all got different ideas of what a hero is and how we may define it. And in fact, you know, I might say that's a chair, but you might say it's not a chair, that's a tree stump. Yeah, but I say, you know, people can sit on it, it's a chair. So we disagree on abstract ideas and labels, and this includes morality. And what will happen is, if all the sentient creatures in the universe died, there would be no abstract ideas, right? Because there'd be no conceiving minds to have these ideas.
The same goes for the word math, like what math is. This is the problem with people who talk about math. Math preceded all minds and all humans, and it's like...
So, no, well, this is a really interesting debate. So traditionally, there have been a lot of mathematical Platonists. So the opposite to my position is a Platonic realist who believes that there's this kind of realm where the perfect forms of all these abstract ideas exist, and we are just trying to, like, you know, the better we accord with those perfect forms, the better we are, or whatever. There's different forms of Platonic realism or realism. So in mathematics, Platonic mathematical Platonists would say that maths exists outside of our brains. Mathematic formalists would say maths is a language we use to describe reality, and we construct mathematics as a language. But as soon as we all die as sentient creatures, mathematics will die. There's just properties out there, but what we've done is we created a language with a bunch of descriptive laws to explain all the data we see. The same with natural laws, the same with like physics and chemistry. We create these languages to understand the world, right? And so that's how language works and abstract ideas works. And what this then means is this is perfectly explains the data around us, which is everyone disagrees on stuff, and when we agree on things we write dictionaries, and when we agree on things we write encyclopedias, and when we agree on moral laws we get together and we say this should be law, and then we vote in politicians to try and enact that into law, and we have a Supreme Court, or we have a lawyer, or whatever, or we create the UN Charter of Human Rights, or whatever. So when we agree, we write these things, but they don't exist out there. We've constructed them. And in fact, we'll find that we'll disagree on certain laws depending on what country you're in and what time you're in. So to say that morality is objective and exists outside of our minds, to me, is just obviously nonsense. Now, that's not to say that if we all use good rational argument and come at things with the same amount of knowledge, that we should agree on moral laws, what good moral laws should be. That's fair enough. We could have subjective moral universalism. We could all agree on the right thing on moral, you know, diktats if we are coming at this with the same knowledge and same rationality. But it doesn't mean it exists out there. We have just described our understanding of reality in the same way because we've got similar brains and we're using similar mechanisms. So the idea that morality is objective, I think, is inherently problematic. You know, we shouldn't kill babies. Yeah, but what if, you know, would it be a good thing to kill a baby if someone said, I'm going to blow up the entire universe if you don't kill a baby? Like, does it become good then, or is it just less bad? You know, and of course, we're just creating words and ideas and constructing them, and we can think of ways around these problems. And it's anyway, you know, so the moral objectivist in this case were a bit like so Immanuel Kant believed in categorical imperatives, these categorically true moral proclamations, like it's wrong to lie, and then you start thinking of these ways to show that could be a problem. It's called the inquiring murderer. It's a very famous thought experiment, which is to say Derek's at home in his house and he's hiding Jack and Jill, these kids, upstairs because he knows there's a child murderer around. Murderer comes to his house, rings on the doorbell and says, do you know where Jack and Jill are? Because I want to kill them. Now, is it right for Derek to lie and say, oh, I don't know, I think they might have gone off down the road? Like Immanuel Kant would say, well, that's wrong to lie. You should tell them where they are. And, you know, and so you have you have lots of problems. Now there are ways around that, and I'm simplifying greatly here, but the idea for me that in moral absolutism and objective moral categorical truths is a real problem for my worldview and how I create my ontology and my epistemology and everything, yada yada yada. But I think it's really important to just set that out so that you understand why I would reject the moral argument just on an ontological level, right down here. You know, so if William Lane Craig came to me and said, well, of course, you know, second premise is objective moral values and duties do exist, I would say, no, they don't. No, they don't. And interestingly, he's a conceptual nominalist in certain ways. So he actually holds to nominalism in I think in terms of mathematics and things. So he picks and chooses what he wants to be objectively true and not. So anyway, there you go.
Oh, there's so much with this, and I've heard it 1,000 times with the whole moral issue from Christians. And this is why the best thing I can do when you're dealing with people who want to talk about you're taking from our worldview to have moral values, the most ridiculous thing is show them, number one, where the morals that Christianity developed from, also from the surrounding nations that were not Jewish. Okay. And number two, look at your own book and look at how you hopscotch to get around all the immorality in it. You don't think it's okay to own other human beings and beat them to the brink of death as long as they don't die. You're okay within 3 days. On the fourth day, I don't think it matters. But if they live for 3 and they don't die, like there's weird laws. This is old stuff. You know, is this immoral? Obviously. That's why they want to act like, no, this is just an old job in the ancient world. You're just working for McDonald's and they're just normal employers. They want to just talk about that rather than getting into chattel slavery, sex slavery, all of that stuff that is condoned, endorsed in the Bible. So
Brad at the side here is saying, as a parent, you should already know what moral obligation is. I don't know if he's talking to me here, but like, you've got to understand what I'm saying here is an ontological argument. It's not saying I have no morality. I'm not amoral. I'm a moral agent who has my own constructed moral framework. Largely psychological, which is to say that, you know, do unto others as you have done unto yourself. So I think that's the golden rule is really super important for having a workable social species such as we are. And of course, I would be explaining moral obligations to my children and saying, you know, you should do this because of this, right? And I'll be hopefully giving them good moral reasoning to do so. Of course, if you're saying that God is the foundation of moral reasoning, but God is the foundation of morality and not moral reasoning, this is the whole problem with divine command theory, then there is no reason. Like, I can't give moral reasoning to my children as why they should do this or that, because it should just be do this because God, right? So like, I can actually account for like pragmatic morality far better, and everyday morality far better than a Christian can, who completely you know, necessitates God to ground their morality and to make sense of their morality. And all that becomes is an epistemological problem, which is, okay, if God grounds your morality, how do you know what that morality is? This is just a case of revelation then. This is just an epistemological argument. How do you know you've got that God's morality right? How do you know you've got the right God such that you can then get the right morality from that God? And, you know, it's just an epistemological problem. Yeah. So just going to run through really quickly just my worldview very quick to make sure this is down so everyone understands. 1, abstract ideas only exist in the minds of conceivers and not in some objective realm. 2, therefore, in order to get moral agreement, we need to use moral reasoning and data derived from the world around us and bring them together to argue for certain moral positions. This is actually evidence in the world around us because this is actually what we have done and continue to do. 3, when we agree with each other, we use democratic mechanisms to vote in lawmakers to create laws on our behalf, or have a system of independent lawmakers who operate fairly with fail-safes and checks and balances to ensure this, again, evidenced in the world around us. It's actually what we do. 4, thus our moral agreements become laws. 5, these laws are then enacted and enforced. 6, the laws can be amended in light of new data or better reasoning. That's just how we operate. It's how we've always operated. But the religious person says, oh, no. Objective morality exists in God. And they're like that. And that's the end of that. So then we come on to, okay, what does that really look like? And generally it's going to be divine command theory, which is one of the most prevalent religious positions. Now,
are we skipping this, or are you just briefly touching it and we're leaving? Because you said you wanted to do an entire episode on divine command theory, right?
So this chapter, and I deal with this really concisely because this is huge, but I think I give something like 16 arguments against divine command theory. Now, that would take us about an hour and a half to do. Like, divine command theory is thoroughly broken. But just really quickly, I'll run off the headings to each of the arguments, and then, you know, we can come back to this.
Yeah, let's do an episode devoted to it.
So divine command theory is basically the things are good because God demands them. God commands them, right? And then they say, well, you know, and then they try and go one stage further and says, well, it's not just arbitrary because it comes from God's nature. Well, it's exactly the same argument. Instead of it's not good because God said it's good, it's because God's nature is good. It's just the same argument. It's just, you see this quite a lot with Christians try to get around it with the nature argument. It doesn't work. Anyway, here they are. There's so a problem with arbitrariness. So, you know, what makes something good? Is it just because God says it? Well, okay, that's just arbitrary. In order for it not to be arbitrary, you need to present moral reasoning. Well, if you're going to present moral reasoning to say what is good or bad, then it's the moral reasoning that grounds what is good or bad. In other words, you don't need God. So this is the fundamental problem of divine command theory: is you don't need God. Is that you require God for morality, and therefore you can't use moral reasoning. And of course, this is a massive problem because moral reasoning is what obviously we use all the time, and is what grounds really morality. There's a direction of causality is another argument, which is to say, is lovingness good because God has it, or is God good because he has lovingness, mercy, and kindness? Are they good in their own right, or are they good just because God has them? There's a direction of causality issue. Are we only good because we reflect God? So when you see someone being good over there, it's like, oh, that was awesome. But you can't say that was awesome because X, Y, and Z. You have to say that was awesome because that was so reflective of God. And that's it. That's the end of the conversation. Divine command theory defies everyday moral reasoning and intuition. Again, that sort of same thing, which is like, I know why that's good. And my moral intuition and my everyday morality, that was good because that brought about a greater good for these, and that's really kind, and that blah, blah, blah. That makes sense of moral agency, whereas just reflecting God doesn't. Which God? Which commands? You know, again, it goes back to this being an epistemological argument. Genocide and ordinary morality. I mean, really, genocide, God commanded it. How is genocide good? And then, of course, they have to like justify the genocide, which is they employ moral reasoning to try and justify that. You know, you get your underwear.
That happens too much.
Yeah. And why is God a better stopping point? You know, why is saying, you know, there's an interesting question where you can get into some meta-ethical like conversations about, well, why is God a better stopping point than moral reasoning? What's better about that? Why follow the commands? Are we just following God's commands so that we can get into heaven and avoid hell? In that case, why is that good? That's just self. You know, there's just a lot of egotism to that. Anyway, and things that aren't commanded, like when we're not, if God hasn't commanded something, how do we work out whether it's good or bad? You know, what metric can we use? Because if we start using a metric that's that's outside of God, then of course that metric is what grounds morality, and we don't need God for morality. And then when you quite often you say, oh, there's rape in the Bible, and this is such a good argument, and Christians will come back and say, well, God would never command rape, right? In order to say God would never command rape, you have to know that rape is already bad using moral reasoning, right? So you can't say that God would never command rape without already establishing it is morally bad outside of God. But they don't do that because they can't do that, because then you are using secular morality.
Even if they did, I can't imagine the gymnastics they'll do when you show them text where God is speaking through the prophets about how he's going to have the other nations come and rape their women.
Yep.
Like he's going to cause this calamity, this evil. Like what? I mean,
so you got Judges 21, Numbers 31,
crazy.
Deuteronomy 20, 22, 22, Samuel 12, Deuteronomy 21, Judges 5, Exodus 21, Zechariah 14, all sorts of stuff about, you know, genocide, rape, plunder, pillaging. You know, yeah, I'm not sure that you know, divine command theory, you know, makes a lot of sense of the biblical data. God cannot know it is itself all good. So if God's sitting there and says, yeah, I'm obviously all good, God couldn't know that, because in order to be able to evaluate himself, he would need an objective benchmark or standard to do that. But if God is the standard, then he can't actually evaluate whether he is himself good, because it's just some kind of circular argument there. He's got no way of being able to know whether he is good. The moral development of children. So the data to suggest that children who are told why they are doing things, why it's bad or good, and given sort of secular reasoning, moral reasoning to base their judgments, moral judgments, end up being sort of better moral agents and have greater well-being and stuff like that. So, you know, that doesn't really fit well with you know, with divine command theory, which is psychologically a bit stunted in terms of your psychological growth, because you're just like, yeah, don't do that. Why? Good, because God. Okay, brilliant. You know, there's, yeah, there you go. And again, non-Christians who have no access to Christianity, how does divine command theory work with them? You know, Amazonian tribespeople, and again, we get back to this problem, but from a different angle. And then you've got Stephen Mason's ordinary morality presupposes atheism. Now, I won't go into that. We'll do that in another video, but that's a really interesting thought. It's, or really not thought experiment. He's produced a paper and a really good argument to say that actually religious divine command theory and religious morality leads to moral paralysis, because you would always want a greater good to come about. So therefore you'd let people be beaten up on the side of the road and not intervene, because if you're intervening, you're stopping a necessary greater good coming back. Anyway, it's quite in-depth, interesting argument. We can talk about that again. And the last point is that God is a consequentialist. So the whole idea that divine command theory is how, you know, how morality works, and it's objectively grounded in God. It is a problem, because when you look at all theodicies, they appear to use consequentialist moral evaluation, which is to say that the morality of any given action is derived from the consequences that it obtains. So when you're talking about why is it good that God killed all of humanity in a flood and all these animals, then the religious person has to come up with some kind of theodicy. You say, well, because it brought this greater good about. You know, he's got to start again, and that was better. And there's some why does Jesus sacrifice? Well, it brought about this greater good. Why is there suffering in the world? Because free will is a greater good, or the soul building theodicy. So all theodicies are actually forms of consequentialist moral reasoning. And of course, that's secular. You don't need God for that. So, yeah. Anyway, that my chapter on that goes into more detail on each of those points. Sorry, too much talking.
No. It's really interesting. Your next chapter is on free will, but just to point out, I always thought at the end that Christians worship free will over like the reality of what the text says, because they want to get God off the hook so much. I mean, it's one of those things. So. Yeah, let me get the super chat real quick here.
Yeah, of course.
Doc Pleroma in the house. If
Legend.
a task needs to be done in virtue of the fact that it is on the to-do list, then it cannot be the reason that it is on the list, is that it needs to be done. Think about that one. I think he means
3
at 3 a.m.
Yeah, so that's an analogy for the divine command theory problem. You know, do you do it because it's on the list, or do you do it because there is need to do it and there is good reason to do that? So that's a really nice analogy. I like that. Thanks,
Doc. Thank you so much for the super chat, man. I will be thinking not about that at 3 a.m. in the morning. I'll be sleeping. B Bear, thank you for the super chat. Good to see you in the chat here. What do you think of Plato's noble lie? Do you see any value?
So,
is this like the white lie-ish type of thing?
The answer to any question like this is it depends what your moral value system is. I will broadly. So I said earlier that I don't think I construct my own morality in my mind using a bit of psychology and broadly consequentialism. Knowing that consequentialism, there's no. So what's really interesting about morality is that after 3,000 years of doing moral philosophy, philosophers are still split about three ways on what the correct moral value system is, which broadly tells you that there is no correct moral value system. I think it leads towards my kind of moral skepticism, which is there is no one moral value system that works. So consequentialism, I think, is broadly useful and good, and I will use it on a daily basis, which is I will do that because that action brings about a greater outcome for as many people as it does, and that's better than bringing about that outcome for only one person or no one. And so therefore, I use that as a rule of thumb to help me operate on a daily basis. But it's not perfect, okay? And you can think of, so for example, the great example of moral consequentialism is the train trolley thought experiment. Yeah. So the idea that you've got 5 people on the train track and there's a trolley racing towards them. If you pull a lever, it will divert, and there's only one person, and it will divert and kill the one person, not the 5. So you're saving 4 people as a calculation, and so therefore most people end up doing that. And most people put something like 89% of people will pull the lever. Turns out that instead of pulling the lever, if you push this person off who's big enough to be able to block the, so you can throw yourself off yourself because you're not big enough, but there is a person just standing there who's big enough to stop the trolley. So you push them off. Even though it's the same calculation, they will block the trolley and die themselves. It turns out that percentage of people that would do that is reversed. And this is really interesting because it shows you that morality isn't just about rationalization, but there's a lot of psychology involved.
Can I just for our audience who may not have quite caught what you're saying there, just to give so that we can paint the picture, because I listened to this. I don't know why I can't think of the famous philosopher who shared this with me on my channel. Anyway, the first one you made very clear. There's one person on this track. If I pull the lever, it won't. The train track trolley won't kill the 5, it'll kill 1. You are responsible for pulling that lever.
Yeah.
But most people naturally feel like, you know what? I think pulling the lever is the best move. I'd rather one person die than 5. But in the next exact same, in a sense, example where 5 people are on the line or 1, you can push the person physically off the bridge to hit the trolley to stop the trolley from killing the 5. Or not do nothing, let that one person stay alive, and let the trolley kill 5 people. Most people will not push that person off the ledge and let the 5 people die. Same exact numbers.
Yeah, exactly. The same calculation, but there's psychology involved. And so what this tells us is that psychology is a really important component in moral reasoning or moral action. So, like, people can pull a lever, but they can't push someone. And this explains why you can drop a bomb, like Enola Gay can explode and kill 100,000 or 80,000 people, whatever, in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. You can pull a lever to drop a bomb that kills all that many people. But if you were to walk around and individually kill each of those people yourself personally, you'd find that a lot harder than just pulling a lever. So this explains, moral activity in the world, which is to say that we have moral value systems that we use to do moral rationalizations, but it's not actually how we always do our morality on a daily basis. There's a lot of psychology involved. There's a lot of empathy involved. And this is why, and to go back to certain autistics, I mean, I remember teaching someone who threw a pencil in someone else's face, in their eye, and I had to sit them down and say, look, but they were on the autistic spectrum. And I said, look, surely you know what it feels like to throw a pencil in that person's eye. Why did you do that? And they didn't actually know what it would feel like. They couldn't do that into subjectivity. They couldn't put themselves in the other person's shoes. So therefore, they had no reason not to throw that. That I desire to throw this. I can't imagine what it would feel like to have this in my eye because my brain can't do that. So I'm going to do that. In other words, they did a morally bad thing from my point of view, from looking on and thinking these are two, this is just a neurotypical child. And actually they did a morally bad thing from my point of view, but actually wasn't morally bad because they had no way of being able to empathize in the same way. And so therefore, you can do your raw calculation. That was bad because the outcome is bad. But then if your intentions and your knowledge and your ability, there's psychology involved is the point. And so that's really important for how we do our morality. Now, going back to what the question is here, can you have a noble lie? Can you have if my partner says, does my bum look big in this dress? Is it right for me to say, no, even though she's got a ballooning backside? She doesn't, but imagine she does. And I'll get in trouble.
See, are you telling a noble lie right now by saying you're not lying about this?
Who knows? Who knows?
I'm kidding with you.
Second guess, but in other words, it depends what your moral framework is, and so I would think the inquiring murderer. I think it's right to lie to stop the murderer killing the children that are hiding upstairs, or whatever. So, but we can disagree on this. But how do we disagree? We use moral reasoning, and which is important. So we are using our moral reasoning to do that rather than saying, is that right? Well, I don't know. Does it reflect God? What did God tell me to do? It kind of ends a conversation. You either can't even answer it because I don't know what God would command, or I'm using this, it's a conversation killer. The divine command theory.
I'll tell you this, just to give you a personal example of me telling a white lie, if that's the same as Plato's noble lie. My very close friend recently overdosed and died a couple months back, and his sister, they were born, raised devout Catholics. Like, we never had the religious conversations. They don't even probably know about this channel. And when she called me and crying and just talking about how she can't understand, he was here yesterday, what happened, that kind of stuff, and she's just like, God, she kept going back to like, God has a plan. He didn't want him to stay here because he didn't want him to suffer. Do you know what I told her? Actually, God doesn't. No, I didn't even do that. I just said, you know what? You're right. You're right. Because I just affirmed whatever she was already concluding. I just went with it. Because what do you say? I'm not this heartless person who doesn't care about how people feel. She hopes she can see him again in the future. She didn't get enough time with her younger brother. Like, all of these things. So the noble lie in that respect made a lot more sense to me than trying to go, actually, listen, you just need to understand and grapple with the natural world in which we live. And I hate to burst the bubble of your upbringing and everything that you believe, that it's probably not true. And no, that would have been more immoral to me than just going with her situation and empathizing and really saying little other than, agreeing with her and going with what she was feeling and experiencing at that time. So anyway,
yeah. So you're promoting social harmony and doing that, which is all part of, Plato's noble lie premise, which is you'd lie to create, a greater good, effectively. Mm-hmm. Really, yeah.
That's my whole goal. B-Bear, great question, right in the vein. Robert Herring in the house, a member of the YouTube channel as well. Thank you for the super sticker, Robert. And Melody Joy in the house, another member. Just giving a shout out to those who are members. Just started the membership program. One more here, and it's pseudo. What is this? Salos? Arguments against the theology of Neoplatonism.
We'll have to deal with that another day. So I'm not a Platonist or a Neoplatonist. So again, these things will cover many different territories, but ontologically speaking, I am, as I explained just earlier on, I am not any form of Platonist. But then it depends what area of Platonic thought you're talking about. So ontologically speaking, my arguments against Platonism would I've established, although they take a lot more to create a solid foundation than just a couple of minutes of me speaking on the YouTube. So yeah.
And our goal was to deal with omni deities and such, but I'd love it if we could devote a live stream Q&A at some point, just you and me hanging out, and people can bring whatever they want.
Yeah, sounds
but
good.
We're dealing with your book in particular. Pseudo, thank you so much for this little $2 here. I seriously appreciate it. But I must admit, it will get sidetracked, and sometimes the questions do that. So thank you, though.
So the next one is about free will. So this is a big one, right? My first book was written on free will, and whether we have it or not, we don't, or at least depends how you define it. So I am a free will skeptic, free will illusionist. So I think we have the illusion of free will, but it doesn't exist. So let's broadly set this out. Well, let's set this out really quickly. And this is super important because actually, if you deny the kind of free will I'm going to talk about in a second, then a judgmental God, especially with divine foreknowledge, makes no sense. Heaven and hell don't really make sense. Okay, and we can talk about crime and punishment. So free will is a really interesting idea in philosophy in terms of what you do with not having it. So actually, not too many people believe in free will in philosophy, or libertarian free will.
Right.
So, and I'll have to say that. So libertarian free will is this ability to, I define it as the real, rational, and conscious ability to do otherwise in a given scenario, all things remaining equal. So if you believe that you could do that, so for example, Derek, you decide to go on holiday to Australia, right? Now, at the point of deciding that, let's call that CC1, causal circumstance. So your causal circumstance is your entire, really, it's the entire universe from the Big Bang or whatever up to the point of you deciding to choose that, right? And you choose A, right? You choose to go to Australia, right? So if the libertarian free willer says that actually if we were to forward wind 10 minutes, we were to carry on living for 10 minutes, and then it doesn't matter whether you can do this or not, but if you could rewind the universe back to that moment, that exact same moment, where everything is identical, like every wave function, every molecule hitting your face, your entire past, everything about your biology, genetics, everything about the entire universe is identical, but it's not even identical. It's the same universe, right? The libertarian says that you could choose otherwise than A, right? So in that causal circumstance, somehow A and not A are true at the same time. And that's arguably breaks what's called the law of non-contradiction. So in this particular circumstance, the libertarian says that you could choose to go to Australia, but you could also choose to go to, I don't know, Bolivia, right? A or B. Now, the problem is if you're rewinding the world back to that exact same moment and everything's the same, what underwrites your decision in the second scenario, which is identical, to go to Bolivia? What could be different about your causal circumstance? What is arguably the grounding objection? What grounds your decision to go to Bolivia? Because if everything is identical, including the weighting of your reasoning, right? So you've got all these arguments as to why you should go to Australia over Bolivia, and you choose Australia in the first scenario. And your weighting has factored into that. So I think this argument is slightly much stronger than this argument. So I'm going to go with Australia. Now, if you rewind to that same scenario, all of those things are identical. So your weighting is exactly the same.
Right.
What underwrites your decision to go to Bolivia? So the libertarian free willer says that you can choose to go to Bolivia and Australia. It's like, hang on, what grounds your decision to do otherwise in a given situation? And most philosophers will say that's impossible. That form of free will, if understood as that being what free will is, so libertarian free will, this really is, doesn't work, right? So philosophers, it turns out that if you look at the metadata of like Phil Paper's studies and whatnot, it turns out that the philosophers who believe in libertarian free will are generally the philosophers who believe in God. So there's a really interesting metadata correlation there, which suggests that they believe in that type of free will, which looks to be philosophically impossible because they bloody need it, because they also have a belief in God and a belief in heaven and hell. And if you can't get heaven and hell unless God is judging you such that you could have done otherwise than you did. You just chose not to do that. And so therefore you're going to go to heaven or hell. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. Can I give you a few examples of something in this libertarian free will thing to get your opinion on?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if we did a statistic, let's say we all hypothetical here, we get 100 people and we tell them, we want you to take your libertarian free will and starve to death. We'll make sure your families are rich after this or something. Really, that's giving them a motivation. But you know, if you really test the parameters of our natural, you know, cause and effect abilities as humans to starve ourselves, libertarian free will, to death, okay, the likelihood of that statistic from 1 to 100 of intentionally starving yourself to death and not snapping. There's food right there. I don't have to starve to death. I have a choice. And they choose to actually starve to death. It's extremely unlikely under those circumstances they're probably going to die, unless whatever I don't see how, maybe their life sucked to begin with, and they thought, this is better dying and getting my family rich. Let's say there's no money involved. We give them the choice to do this. The likeliness of them starving themselves to death is a very unlikely choice. We hear Christians oftentimes say, you freely choose hell. God doesn't make you go to hell. In your libertarian free will, you freely choose to go to hell. I don't know about you, but no one from what I understand, with any common sense, who has the choice to actually go and eat the food isn't going to starve themselves to death. And this idea that they're going to freely choose to go to hell, as if they cognitively knew what they were doing and getting themselves into, is just absurd to me. So I wanted to paint, I guess, some type of natural phenomena to give an example, but then they go even further and say, oh, and by the way, they continue to freely choose in hell to be in hell, and they don't want forgiveness. How dumb is that?
And we'll get on to arguments of heaven and hell in the next video.
Okay.
Because, but you're absolutely right. You know, it's thoroughly problematic. I mean, when you're comparing being able to really choose A or B, A or not A in the same causal circumstance. So the only thing that makes sense of that, if you do believe that someone could genuinely choose two different things given identical causal circumstances, the only thing that could really make sense of that is indeterminism, which is to say that there may be some quantum fluctuation that means that there is at some base level randomness, right? That's the only thing. It's like if I chose this or this, and I've got exactly the same situation, what could underwrite the fact that I could do two different things? Well, one of those variables might be based on random, so that actually this time it was that, but the next time it's that.
Right.
But of course, if you believe in quantum indeterminacy, that doesn't really get you free will. Like, so as I defined it, real, rational, and conscious ability to choose otherwise. You wouldn't have ownership over that decision if it was based on like some kind of quantum randomness.
Right.
So in philosophy, you know, you'll get people who will say, well, I'm not a causal determinist. I don't believe that everything is like causally determined in the universe. I think there is random at quantum level. Okay, fair enough. If you believe in quantum randomness or quantum indeterminacy, that's fine. It still won't get you libertarian free will because you don't have rational ownership over quantum indeterminacy, right? So like you can't have God saying, right, you're going to go to hell because you chose to do that, even though you chose to do that as a result of some quantum indeterminacy fluctuating in your brain, right? That you know. So what the point is, that indeterminacy of that ilk is not a good bedfellow for libertarian free will. So it doesn't get you libertarian free will. So
that cause and effect issue too just drives me to think from my own experiences what makes the most plausible. Like if I go back and relive those moments of when I made decisions, I know exactly why I ultimately went with decisions. I don't live every day 50-50 on every decision I ever make. That's ridiculous. I am usually pushed by a cause that has an effect from my choices. It just seems that's the most plausible. I don't know if that plays in the role or not, but
yeah. So the kind of analogy I always say, which is kind of what you're saying, I always use is if you go to a psychologist or psychiatrist, right, sit down in their chaise longue, right, and they say, okay, you know, what's this behavior that you have that you've done that you don't like? And you explain this behavior, and they say, did you choose to do that? And you say, yeah, I chose to do that. And they say, thank you very much. That's $150. It turns out you chose to do that. You just use your free will. It's free will that did it. So I can't really help you. No one does that. What they do is they try and understand why you chose that. Right. Which is like, okay, tell me something about your family background. Tell me something about your upbringing. Tell me something about what you know. So it's like you've talked about addiction. What were the drivers in your addiction? It's like no one goes, oh, you just chose to do that, Derek. There you go. Whatever, it was your free will. It's like, no, what were the things that were in play? Like, that's psychology. It's understanding why we do stuff, understanding human behavior. So that kind of demands, in my opinion, a kind of a causal deterministic understanding of the universe, of human behavior. Because if there weren't reasons for doing stuff, if it's just free will as some kind of magic thing, then that's a conversation killer, and it stops inquiry, and it stops us understanding how things really work and why things happen.
Well put. Well put. Couple super chats. Crossover Maniac dropping the atomic bombs on Japan to avoid even more deaths in a conventional invasion to end World War II equals real life trolley dilemma. Right.
This could be an hour rabbit hole, but I do want to just mention this a little bit. I went through life, so this is one of the things like the global flood. You hear about the atomic bomb in Hiroshima, and it just becomes part of your that's what happened, and you did it to stop the war and save all these people, and you're just like, right, job done, and you don't really think about it, right, until you're like, I remember thinking about this at like 35, and then doing a bit of just doing like a philosophy lesson, and just suddenly realizing, hang on, I've never really thought about this and about whether that was absolutely monstrous. Right. So imagine now in Ukraine, right, or in Russia now, imagine we went and dropped a nuclear missile on Moscow and killed 1 million people. Yeah, it would stop the Ukraine war, and you could, you know, but would we not just go absolutely insane at like all of those innocent civilians killed? Mm-hmm. But actually, this is the trolley dilemma, just on a massive scale. Now, it's really uncomfortable. The problem is whether you know it will definitely stop. Like, if you 100% knew that's going to stop, then that's a calculation they made. But it's pretty egregious that they had to kill that many people. Did they have to kill that many people? Could they have made the bomb half as small and still done the job? But this is moral consequentialism. That's a whole theory behind the atomic bomb. And that's why I say, like, consequentialism isn't a perfect moral value system, because you can look at things like that and go, actually, I don't feel comfortable about dropping a bomb on an entire city, even though it arguably brought about a greater good. And then we can argue whether that actually did happen.
While it definitely stopped the war from happening, okay, with them, the issue, though, notice there's already these treaties coming on saying, hey, we're not doing that anymore. Like, everybody realized how bad this was. People were signing and coming up with, what did they call that? There's like a common law worldwide, like not to nuke anyone. We have an agreement.
Mutual assured destruction.
It's some like, dude, we realized this was not what we want. So thank you, Crossover. Jake K, opinions, Christian rhetoric of love, charity, hope, etc.
I'm not sure what that means, Jake. You might have to just expand on that. Love, charity, and hope. I mean, we could talk about going back to divine command theory. Are those things good because God has them, or are they good independent of God? And therefore, you know, what's the direction of causality there? And is that a problem for God, belief in God as being the objective moral grounding of all good things like love, charity, and hope? And I would say that they're good for reasons that are you know, secular moral reasoning reasons, rather than just because God has them. I don't know if that's what you wanted to talk about, but that's how I've answered it.
Yeah, I'm looking. I didn't see Jake. I'll try and keep an eye out. I'm going to answer the next one here, and then we'll get to that. Mr. Monster in the house, good to see you here. Whenever there's a gap of information I can't seem to fill I just put in Jonathan MS Pearce. I call it the John of the Gaps.
I just snorted. That made me laugh. Thank you, Mr. Monster. I think that's very kind of you. Yes. I don't know what to say to that. What a ledge.
Just accept that you fill the gap, man. Just go ahead and accept it. You know what I mean?
So many jokes.
I accept it. It's okay. I created this world for you to fill the gaps, you know. So it's There's another one. Crossover Maniacs back. I don't think theists really believe in libertarian free will, not when they also believe in an interventionist God. You'd really want to have to be a deist or atheist to believe in libertarian free will.
That's a really interesting point you've made there. So every time God interacts with humanity is effectively, and you can include miracles in that, every time God steps in the Bible, is to change, is basically to constrain free will. Because if free will really was that important, God wouldn't do anything. God would just set the dominoes going, and then if free will is that important, you guys go for it. And there's a great meme. I love the meme. It says, it's got a picture of God. It says, "I gave you free will. Now do exactly what I want you to do," or something like that. It's phrased much more funnily than that. But it's the idea that I gave you free will, but I'm going to do everything I can so that you can't exercise it and punish you for using it. And so this is really interesting tension between like the biblical narratives and the idea that free will is this amazing thing that we should have, and it's kind of this theodicy that gets rolled out by Christians all the time. Well, of course there's evil and suffering, that it's just a natural byproduct of being able to exercise free will. It's like, yeah, but then every time God gets involved in the Bible, it's constraining our free will, because it's like changing how things were going to be given what we decided they should have been like, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, there's an interesting conversation to be had around that.
Thank you, Crossover, for that super chat. Seriously, I appreciate it. Your sins are forgiven. Jake K is back with explaining, I kind of more meant, what do you think about Christians who endlessly extol things and attributes commonly thought of as good and beautiful and so on?
Yeah, and broadly what I said there, which is okay, how do you ground why they're good and beautiful and et cetera, et cetera? And if you start using secular moral reasoning or secular reasoning, then that's why those things are good and beautiful, and not just because God has them. So yeah, that I think I would answer it in the same way. I'll add a little extra, which is I love the saying God is love. It's like, if God is love, and if God is overflowing with love, and part of his creative impetus for creating the universe is because he had so much love that it just turned into creation, that it's like, is that why he created plate tectonics that kill, that create a tsunami that kills 240,000 people? Is that God is love? Like, if you'd say, what's the definition of God is love? Like, one of the last things I would say is tsunami that kills 240,000 people and countless ecosystems full of animals. I don't know. Maybe it's just me.
Hallelujah. Thank you for that. So, Jonathan, just so we have a tab here, we are at argument 15 now, if I'm not mistaken. What are we getting to? 18?
Well, I said originally we're going to get to 17.
Oh, 17.
Or okay. 17 or 18. I did say 18, I think. I'm not sure that we will. I don't know. Yeah,
because we're running on 2 hours and 10 minutes pretty much almost.
So I could bring it to a close at the at this. So free will, I want to say just a few more things. So I could bring it to 16. I'll try and be really quick though.
Oh yeah, no. I just
is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or after this one. So the free will is really interesting in terms of what we do. So most philosophers nowadays are kind of over whether libertarian free will exists or not. They kind of say, well, it doesn't. Unless you're a theist, they generally don't believe in libertarian free will. So the question is, are they what's called a compatibilist, which is free will and determinism can coexist? Or are they a hard determinist and it's just about causal determinism? Free will, no matter how you define it, it just doesn't exist. And compatibilists will generally say that the free will, they'll redefine free will to say doing what you want, right? So if you can do what you want, that's free will. And then the hard determinists will say, yeah, but what you want is itself determined. Okay, so there's interesting conversation you can have there, but it doesn't really help. None of that. All these people deny libertarian free will. The question is what you do about not having free will in this society now. So this is where the interesting conversations are having. People like Greg Caruso arguing with Daniel Dennett about what kind of free will exists and what we do with crime and punishment. And the reason why I'm telling you this because it's pertinent to heaven and hell. So crime and punishment. What if you don't have free will, which I don't believe we do. I just think it's evolved. It's been a useful thing for evolving social cohesion and being able to say you're responsible for doing that. And if I see you responsible for doing that, I can kind of punish you, which is useful because I don't want that behavior, but I want to reward that. So I give you praise for doing that because that's good. And we want that to happen in our society. You can see why such an illusion could evolve, right? And it's a useful illusion up to a certain point. But nowadays we're like, okay, I can understand why this criminal did this really bad thing. Now so I'm going to send them to prison. There are generally 3 reasons you send people to prison. One is retribution, one is deterrence, and one is rehabilitation. So under the lack of libertarian free will, retribution is pointless. It's like, you're going to prison because you're a complete bastard for doing that. Yeah, but you did that because you were the person you were in the situation you were in, right? And so actually this kind of takes a rug out from under like praiseworthiness and blameworthiness in the same way that is it right to praise an Olympic swimmer for winning gold when actually they just were born with big feet, the biology of having big feet and the right body, and their parents took them and they had the willpower to do so, took them to swimming lessons every day and so on and so forth. All these things are put in place that ends up with them winning a gold medal. No one thinks like that. You're like, yay, Australia, yay, America, or whatever, and everyone cheers and you give them a medal. But essentially, the lack of libertarian free will means that praiseworthiness and blameworthiness intrinsically are problematic. So what do you do with crime and punishment? Okay, retribution is pointless. So it should really be about rehabilitation and deterrence. Well, deterrence is an interesting one because the harsher you punish someone doesn't correlate well with greater deterrence. It turns out that harsh punishments do not deter people more. Only very insignificantly. Generally, what deters people is the chance of being caught. So if you want to stop people committing crimes, you make there a higher chance of them being caught rather than giving them harsher punishments. We know that the data is there. It's just that everyone likes to go be really harsh on crime and punishment. And it's like, send people to prison, send people to prison. Yeah, it doesn't work. Yeah, send people to prison. America's the worst place for this. You've got such a bad prison culture because politicians think they need to be hard on crime. And being hard on crime just means locking people up willy-nilly and for longer periods of time. But it doesn't work.
It makes more criminals often too, by the way.
Exactly. And it turns out that if you want to look at the best recidivism rates in the world, which recidivism is repeat offending. So prisons in America and the UK are like revolving doors. You commit a crime, go to prison, learn how to do it better, go out, commit a crime again, go back into prison, come out, go back into prison, come out, go back. That's really poor. I think 85% in certain crimes, recidivism rates. Whereas Norway has like 30% recidivism, best in the world, but they've got these kind of liberal prisons where they're like given skills. But that's how it should be. It's like, so what's the job of doing prison here? It's rehabilitation. I want you're not going to be in prison forever, right? Because the crime you committed doesn't warrant that or whatever. You're going to be in prison for a certain amount of time. When you're out of prison, I don't want you coming back in here. Not only is it more expensive, right, to just keep sending you to prison and going through the whole criminal process, but actually it's not good for society. What I want you to do is leave prison and have the skills such that you don't commit that crime again. So what you do is you skill them up, you give them these skills so they learn stuff in prison, they become enfranchised and they become members of society, and you let them go. And they go out and they don't commit another crime because they've got the right skills and they've got like aspirations. And so that's really, really important in my view of the world. It's a quarantine method of crime and punishment, which is to say that it's morally right for me to quarantine you if you've got a really bad disease that's contagious, right? And it's going to affect other people. It's right for me to quarantine you humanely and work really hard to make sure that you get better, Derek. And when I'm absolutely sure you're better, and this is the problem with crime, we're never absolutely sure that someone's not going to commit the same crime when they're out of prison again. But if you as an ill person, and I make you better, then if I'm sure that you're not going to go out and be contagious out there, then I will rehabilitate you and send you back out to society. That's fine. That's morally fine. The quarantine approach to healthcare is fine. We apply that to crime and punishment. So when you go into prison, I'm going to work really hard to make sure you're humanely looked after, and that I give you all the rehabilitation you need, so that if you are let back out, you don't commit the crime again. You are not contagious to other people and causing them problems. And if you are locked away forever because you are never going to get well, then at least you're treated humanely. That's anyway. Right. So that the reason why I went down that rabbit hole is because when we're talking about heaven and hell, the question is, what's the point of sending one to hell for eternity? Because there's no idea of rehabilitation there. So they've committed this crime that God knows in advance they're going to do, and then they're committed to hell forever or heaven forever. It's like, but if you're committed to hell forever, if that's what you believe, and there are different beliefs, how does that make sense of A, the fact that you couldn't do otherwise, the whole free will thing, and B, what's the point of committing you to hell for eternity? What's a rehabilitative, rationale here? Like, you're just punished for eternity for a finite sin. Anyway, we'll talk about that.
Yeah, and that's exactly, I was going to say, and I knew if I said something, you would go, well, we're going to get to that. Because you do that. I start getting into your arguments later, because that's the problem. Like, how does this finite little one blimp of a moment,
they're all connected,
all eternity? Anyway, yeah, there's a lot here. But I do think, just my little comment, I would like to say our morality as a social creature, if we keep progressing, if we keep going and we don't backslide to scratching sticks and stones again and become brutes, I think we're going to think, well, I think we're already seeing people say that the injustice of prison systems is the case. But I'm really thinking, like you're talking about with this much better success rate in other countries on how they do this, I think that we're going to realize the way we are locking people up, but we already, scientists are aware, I'm sure, are aware how locking someone in a room 23 hours a day, 1 hour a day, they can go eat, and that's it during the break, is creating a monster and psychologically screwing someone up.
Yeah, there's some new data that's just come out to suggest that how psychologically damaging solitary confinement is and stuff like that. Yeah, it's really problematic. So I mean, and at the end of the day, it's also cheaper. Like, the problem is rehabilitation seems expensive up front, right? Because you just look at the cost of rehabilitation, but actually if you're doing it over 20 years of this person not coming back to prison, going through the courts and all that, it's way cheaper to do rehabilitation. But no one looks on the long term, they just look at the short term. Anyway,
that's all. I just figured I'd say, like, I think we're going to look back and go, what were we doing? That also brought me to another thing I was going to say just briefly. If we were, let's say, you know how we have all the food packaged to us, we're talking about the lever deal with the train cart. Or imagine every restaurant you went to, you had to meet the food you were going to eat when it was alive. Oh, meet Bobby, the sheep. Okay, how do you want him cooked? You're probably not going to want to eat meat after a while. Like maybe in China, they have crazy like dogs and everything in cages they're killing and like doing it all there. I'm saying they're used to that. They've been doing that for who knows how long. We have been kind of fed a nice chicken patty without realizing the process behind how we ended up getting this meat. Imagine if we meet Daffy Duck. We call him Daffy. How do you want him cooked? We'll probably start being more vegan or.
I imagine in 100 years' time, humanity will look back and say, what, you used to eat meat? It'll get to that like morally progressed period where we don't need to eat meat, and once we've got the food technology in place where it tastes just the same, it has exactly the same texture that we used to, or whatever, or we've just morally changed it enough that we can get over that, and that becomes normal or whatever. We'll look back and go, I can't believe we used to eat meat. That's barbaric. Honestly, because I just think that's where it's going.
I think that might be the case. Yeah.
Thank you, Vaguely Agnostic, who's also a really good supporter.
Seriously, thank you. I really appreciate it.
legend. So we've got two quick chapters to just race through. And this is again talking about morality. So I've talked about free will, which it could be like 5 hours of chat in itself. So chapter 15 is the Bible is not a good source of morality. And the idea that the Bible is this great source of morality, this is getting to the particulars of, say, Christianity or Judaism here. So I do admit that. It is really a problem. So, you know, we learn it's wrong to commit genocide, but, you know, God and Yahwists did it in 1 Samuel 15 and Exodus 17. It's wrong to lie, but God did, certainly by proxy, e.g. 1 Kings 22, Jeremiah 4, 2 Thessalonians 2:11, and others. It's wrong to rape, but God sanctioned it, Judges 21, Numbers 31, Deuteronomy 20, 21, 22. It's wrong to own slaves, but God allowed for it, e.g., you know, Leviticus 25, Exodus 21, so on and so forth. The idea that we have these really morally problematic scenarios like slavery, we're all agreed that the UN Declaration of Human Rights says, yeah, slavery in all its forms is bad, and yet the Bible countenances it. Like, is the Bible a good revelation of moral values? No.
You already know. Yeah, you already know where I'm at.
And you know, we can talk about, let's just really rush through some examples. Noah's flood. Mass murder is okay if you've messed up your project. So that's that. I'm just giving you headings of the different ones I talk about. Mutilating a penis can change God's mind. So this is what happens when God was going to, I think, kill Moses, and then Moses' wife circumcised her son's penis and then touched either Moses' feet or his head with it or something. But God changed his mind. So apparently, you know, cutting off a penis can change God's mind. That's a nice moral lesson to learn, isn't it? So next time you think God's going to punish you, just maybe cut off the end of your penis. Slavery's fine. Just don't treat them too badly. I'm doing a series on slavery myself on my own channel, and the reaction of biblical scholarship to slavery is morally abhorrent. Slavery is a real problem. So I've got this thing. If the Bible fails on slavery, the Bible fails. Full stop, right? So if Christianity fails on slavery, then it fails. The Bible does fail on slavery. Therefore, I don't care what anything else the Bible says. It fails. It's almost like, this is where I've got to a point in my life where, like, no, it's ridiculous. Just no, I don't need to entertain. And I've written books and books and books on this stuff. But I'm like, it so obviously fails on slavery. I don't need to take it seriously about anything else. Like, it is calamitously failed. Jog on.
Yeah, I got a couple books in the mail actually, just recently.
The Bad Jesus. So Hector Avalos's book on slavery is so far, I've not finished that. That is so far is brilliant. It's a brilliant book.
Slavery, Abolitionism, and the Ethics of Biblical Scholarship.
Yeah. So I'm doing a book series. I'm doing a video series on that book. So I'm due to do the second one this week. So yeah, check that out if you care.
Oh,
but
yeah.
So slavery, homosexual activity deserves death. Victims of rape must marry their rapists. It's okay to test someone's loyalty by making them almost kill their own son. Abraham and Isaac is just a morally abhorrent story. I hate it. God loves to kill children and animals by the nation load. I mean, you know, Exodus. Again, we think of the Exodus and 10 plagues of Egypt like it's in our cultural memory. Mm-hmm. We learn it as kids, but it's a morally disgusting story.
Every firstborn Egyptian son, blah, gone.
Killed because Pharaoh said no, even though God changed Pharaoh's heart. You know, he hardened his heart.
He hardened his heart, yeah.
And then kills children on account of that. It's just morally disgusting. As genocide. And have you spoken to David Madison?
I have.
About his book, The
yes.
10 Things.
We've already gone through we did 2 different videos, 1 through 5, 6 through 10.
So all those things that Jesus said in there are added onto this. right? Is the Bible a good moral guide? No. And even what Jesus says is morally really problematic, or at least a lot of what
it is bad. Yeah, there's a lot of bad things that you don't pay attention to that are there. Yeah.
Yeah. So so that's really really problematic. And we could go into detail about how morally problematic the Bible is, but most of your viewers will have very concrete views on how distasteful, morally speaking, the Bible is. And the problem is so this is how morality should work, or moral reasoning should work, is that 1, do your moral reasoning first. 2, then appraise ancient books for their moral value based on our moral reasoning. So get your morality sorted out, then appraise the Bible. But the problem is we don't do that. What happens is the Christians assume the moral genius of a very old parochial patriarchal book and have that as your axiom, and then 2, spend the rest of their lives mentally contorting and gerrymandering to square those absolute moral claims and lessons with their modern moral reasoning. That's the wrong way of doing morality. Don't do it like that.
Yeah, but that's exactly how apologists do it.
Of course. And if you start with, and what's really good about that Hector Avalos book on slavery is he talks about this. He talks about how I've got it in here. I'm just going to read you a little bit from this, because this is really, really super important. So in the beginning of the introduction, he says, my project actually began with a puzzling experience. If one reads almost any book on Christian ethics written by academic biblical scholars, one finds something extremely peculiar. Jesus never does anything wrong. And he talks about like how we analyze like Alexander the Great, Caesar Augustus, all these historical figures, and they're nuanced and complex, but you look at Jesus and he's perfect. And then they start with that axiom. This is what I was talking about earlier on in this chat. Scholars start with that axiom and then evaluate the Bible and do biblical exegesis. It's like this is the ultimate circular reasoning. It's like, look, I've done all this evaluation. It turns out Jesus is perfect. Yeah, but you started with the axiom that Jesus is perfect.
This is why no matter where you go, there's always someone who has a different argument. Well, the Old Testament's out of date, that even by the New Testament, that's all done away with. But that's why I have academics coming on to show the slavery in the New Testament. We've got so much stuff to really dive in, and there's just really
But what's good about this book is it's not about looking at the Bible per se and saying this verse is countenance to slavery. This verse, what Hector Avalos does really well here is he looks at biblical scholarship. So he says, okay, let's part the Bible. Let's look at how scholars over time have either justified. So this, I'm going to read you this quote because it's actually diamond. This is page 4. Despite the thoroughly benign manner in which biblical ethics are often represented, the Bible endorses horrific ideas and practices. One of these horrific practices is slavery, one of the most tragic and vicious institutions ever devised by humanity. For about 1,900 of the last 2,000 years of Christian history, it was self-described Christians who kept slavery in some form or another a viable institution. Yet many modern historians and biblical scholars still claim the Bible was a main factor in abolition. So he says, let's look at biblical scholarship, because actually for 1,900 years, biblical scholarship justified slavery, right? And so how you can't come along at the end and say, if it wasn't for biblical scholarship and the Bible, abolition wouldn't have happened.
This would have been different in the 2nd century or something like early on. The fact that it got super comfortable and implemented this practice is a huge sign to telling you Christianity and slavery works perfectly. And I mean, let's get it. If you get into the rhetoric, Paul, a slave, it's not bond servant in some kind way. He claimed to be a slave of Christ. The word is slave in Greek. So it's all over the Bible. It's just there. You can't get rid of it.
So, yeah, I mean, you know, you've got Rodney Stark saying moral fervor is a fundamental topic of his entire book. The potent capacity of monotheism and especially Christianity to activate extraordinary episodes that have shaped Western civilization. And he says, it goes on to say later, just as science arose only once, so too did effective moral opposition to slavery. Christian theology was essential to both. So he's saying that slavery was only abolished because of Christian theology. Well, no, Christian theology countenanced slavery for 1,900 years. All the slave traders were Christians, right? The people who were dealing in slave trade and using slaves were Christians, right? You can't glorify how wonderful Christianity is in being responsible for the abolition, which is a problematic claim anyway, and ignore that it was responsible for the slavery in the first place or justifying it. That's like saying, well done, Derek. That's like you congratulating yourself. This is me, Derek. Well done. I've saved Jimmy from drowning. I've pulled Jimmy out the river, right? But Derek, what you fail to remember is that you threw Jimmy into the river and held his head under, right? So you can't congratulate yourself for saving Jimmy and pulling him out the river when you're the one that threw him in and held his head under. So you can't have Christians lauding like the Bible and Christianity and theology for abolition when that was responsible for slavery being justified in the first place. Anyway,
what about there's active justification in Southern courts where the Bible was used to literally promote slavery? It wasn't just that, well, this is one of those areas the Bible says it's okay to own people, we're going to own people. But no, it goes beyond. They're trying to justify their active continuation of slavery in the South using the Bible.
So what's really interesting, so this is a quote from a pro-slavery Presbyterian clergyman called Fred A. Ross, right, who back in the 1800s, this was the 1800s, said to Albert Barnes. So Albert Barnes was an abolitionist clergyman, right? So he come along saying, look, I've looked in the Bible and I've reinterpreted things, and it turns out that slavery is bad, right? And this is great from Fred A. I mean, it's terrible, but it's great. And it's right, actually. So he says, I think in a letter to him, you get nothing by torturing the English version. People understand English. Nay, you get little by applying the rack of Hebrew and Greek, even before a tribunal of men like you, who proclaim that Moses in Hebrew and Paul in Greek must condemn slavery because it is in violation of the first sentiments of the Declaration of Independence. You find it difficult to persuade men that Moses and Paul were moved by the Holy Ghost to sanction the philosophy of Thomas Jefferson. What he's saying there is like, you can't reinterpret the Bible in light of your Enlightenment thinking and Thomas Jefferson and change all the understanding of language that we've understood very well to countenance slavery and say that actually abolition is the way forward. You are bastardizing the interpretation of the language here and changing the theology when actually me as a clergyman has a correct understanding of biblical theology, and that's why slavery is good.
Mic drop. No, but seriously, I'm glad there were Christians who did jump on the Declaration of Independence and stuff. I mean, I'm glad that happened, but you can't say that was the root cause. I mean, you had
it was complex. It was part of it, but it is complex.
Right.
Yeah.
You have deists who are out here writing this Declaration of Independence anyway. That's a whole different sidetrack. We're rabbit trailing off.
Enlightenment thinking, even economics played a part, and all sorts of different ideas played a part in why abolition took place. But yeah, so anyway, but to go back to these kind of arguments is like, right, if God knew, so this is completely relevant, that rabbit hole is relevant to what we're talking about. If God knew in advance that the Bible as his primary revelation was going to be used for 1,900 years of the last 2,000 years to countenance slavery, he knew that so it's like, I've got a choice of whether this is going to be my revelation or not. And he's like, I'm choosing this as my revelation, and I know it's going to be used to justify slavery for almost 2,000 years. What does that look morally? That's terrible. Does this better support the atheism versus theism? Does it look like OmniGod exists if he's going to use his primary tool of revelation as the Bible, which is going to be misappropriated or in fact correctly appropriated for almost 2,000 years to countenance slavery? This is a huge, huge problem.
It is. It is. Crossover Maniac says, lack of human free will and incarnation cuts both ways. as one could argue for lifetime imprisonment or capital punishment for irredeemable convicts.
Yeah, it's really, so here's an interesting, when I was writing my free will book, I need to rewrite that because it's my first book I wrote like 12 years ago and I'm a better writer now. Really need to rewrite that. Anyway, I had a conversation with my partner in the kitchen saying, oh, there's this really interesting legal case where someone's gone to appeal and he was basically racially abused, an Italian guy, well, an immigrant in Italy. He was racially abused. So he then kicked the heck out of 5 people, I think, and got sent down for 9 years, right? And then they did a genetic analysis of him, and turns out he had some genetic variants that made him predisposed to violence. So I said to my partner, look at this, his genetic code meant he is predisposed to that violent behavior, so therefore he should get some kind of mitigation for his sentence. And this is what the court found, that and he ended up getting his sentence reduced by 2 years. But my partner said, and quite rightly so in many respects, said, well, I would have not reduced his sentence. If he's predisposed to violence, I would increase his sentence. It's safer to keep him in prison. But I was like, oh, that's a good point. Yeah, there you go. And you know, so yeah, these things are complex. It's about doing the most humane thing that brings about the greatest good in this situation, which is rehabilitation and a lack of recidivism.
I said thank you for the super chat crossover. I'm sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I didn't want to stop you.
Damien Kuzmik, Jonathan MS Pearce. Wow, I respect only wordplay, and the logic is 0 points. Thanks. I like to think my logic is worth 0 points, or maybe a little bit more.
Look, now that you know how to discover the side chat, you're in trouble. There's people I know who tell me, they come on, they're like, I'm not even looking at the chat because I'm going to end up getting like distracted. And I'm like, don't worry about it. I'll pay attention to the chat for you.
So the final argument, and we've been going a long time, and so it's well done for everyone who is still here.
Bravo. If you stuck around, you're going to heaven. Don't worry, I promise.
The very quick argument is the next chapter, which says what the Bible doesn't say. So we talked about how morally bad the Bible is, positively bad, like it says these bad things. But what's interesting was what it doesn't say. Let's talk about slavery again. Now, that whole 1,900 years of being used to countenance slavery, imagine the first rule in the Decalogue, in the Ten Commandments, said, by the way, this is God speaking to Moses. He says, Moses, get this down. This is number 1 on the tablet. First tablet, number 1. Number 1, slavery is bad, right? And I want you to write that in capitals. Slavery is bad, right?
Right.
Number 2, refer to number 1. It's that important. We're going to say it again. Slavery is bad. Bigger capitals, 4 exclamation marks, right? There you go. Now, if God had said that to Moses, and Moses comes down and everyone's like, well, what did God tell you? And he says, right, number 1, slavery is bad. Number 2, and it's in capitals, so this is bad. Number 2, slavery is bad with 4 exclamation marks. Like, everyone's going to be like, okay, we're very clear on this. Slavery is bad. But the Bible doesn't say that. And so it's not about as much as what the Bible does say, is as much about what it doesn't say. And it doesn't say things that should be really clear and morally obvious. If the United Nations can come up with a declaration that is morally superior to the Bible, then the Bible isn't the revelation that I think a lot of people think it is.
I agree with you.
And, you know, you can think of all sorts of other things it doesn't say. Jesus didn't come down and say, oh, by the way, boil all the medical implements you're going to use because of here's the germ theory, you know, and explain stuff like that. And that would have saved countless lives. Even if he doesn't explain why, just like some weird rule. By the way, rule number 7 on the tablet is boil all medical implements in boiling water. Then, like, everyone would be like, oh, we've got to do that, some kind of ritual. Okay, let's do it. It would have saved countless lives. Right. But that doesn't happen. Interestingly, prophecies, there's no prophecies about, oh, by the way, in a couple of thousand years, people are going to be flying around in aeroplanes and there's going to be intercontinental ballistic missiles. No prophecy says that. They just say stuff that just so happens to only make sense in that time and place. It's like their prophecies are really like, look like just ex eventu things that people would have said that just like, no, there's no prophecy that's like,
or like common sense things that happen all the time. You just repeat that it's, you know, like, guess what's going to happen? There's going to be a war. Really, numbnuts? I mean, you're kidding me. There's going to be a war? Who would have thunk of that? Wow,
Yeah.
this must be true. I mean,
no one says, oh, by the way, guys, like in a couple of thousand years' time, Elon Musk is going to buy Twitter. Everyone's like, what does that mean? But let's write it. I mean, this is a prophecy. Let's put it down anyway. Like, but no one says that. And because obviously prophecy is just nonsense. So anyway, what the Bible doesn't say is almost as interesting as what it does say.
absolutely. So is this the time I can plug you? I can tell everybody
You
that
can
it
fill
is
my
time.
gap.
It is time. Everybody, go get a book or 2 or 3 or 4. How many have you written?
On like religion and philosophy, probably a dozen. Fiction, 4 now. 3. I've got one that's coming out soon, and a couple of like ones on being a dad of twins and stuff like that. So if you,
Wow,
I don't know, probably 15. So.
you definitely right, man. Go get the 30 arguments against the existence of God, heaven, hell, Satan, and divine design, so we can talk about further arguments when we get back. We'll end up, how many episodes do you think? This would be a couple more at least, right?
Yeah, so at the speed we're going, mate, yeah, probably a couple more.
I think we're covering, every point we can. We got the soul. These are the upcoming ones. I'm just going to read the just these as we go through. The soul doesn't exist. What's the point of heaven and hell? God cannot be perfectly merciful and perfectly just. Weighing our hearts, heaven or hell. Explaining the heaven, me. Free will, the problem of evil and heaven. Why not just create heaven? Satan is God's middle manager. Infinite punishment for finite crimes. Prayer makes little sense. Prayer is not effective, but God is not OmniGod according to the Bible. Bonus argument, icing on the cake. God is not omniscient because it could be living, or says it could be living in the Matrix.
Yeah, so in that whole book, I try really hard to call God it.
Okay,
that was really difficult for me because you use he and him all the time. But I wanted to say God is this abstract idea, this OmniGod, that has no gender. And really, we shouldn't call God he. Not in some kind of progressive modern ideal or whatever, but just seriously, it's just an it. Right. But I'll tell you what, it's difficult. Like the amount of comb throughs of that text, and there's probably still the odd him and he in there. It's so difficult not to just naturally call God he and him. And it sounds weird sometimes because we're not used to it, calling God it. I do it anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely hope you go get the book. Go check out his onlysky.media/Jonathan Pearce. That's his personal blog area where he is on this website. So you can go and intrude in that. You wrote all these?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so there's some stuff on like Ukraine and Russia. That's what that swastika thing's about, like propaganda, Russian propaganda. Twitter, that one up there. Like if you go up, there's one someone doing archaeology. That one's about the soul there, but just go up above the Supreme Court. Up one more. Sorry, that one, the guy doing archaeology. That's really interesting. There's a tablet that's just been found that the biblical.
I've interviewed the guy, by the way. I interviewed the man who discovered the tablet on Mount Ebal.
Yeah, is that?
Yeah, I interviewed him.
Dr. Stripling.
Yep, I interviewed him.
Right, so I think that's a really good article. It's a column, but like that's a bit of journalism I've done there. I've interviewed some people, and Kip Davis, who Dr. Kip Davis has got some good quotes in there because I went to him for like some info on what he thought of Stripling's claims. Anyway, the idea is that Hebrew writing is much earlier and it's got this mention of Yahweh than people originally thought. Therefore, the Bible could be true. It's a load of rubbish. But
go check out his website. YouTube channel is pinned in the comment section right now. Go subscribe. Have you a glass of wine with him if you're not like me and you break out. I'm allergic to alcohol. I break out in handcuffs when I do drink it, so I try not to. Have one for me. And consider also joining MythVision's Patreon, working very hard, covering many topics. Early, this is the one I was playing that had Graham Oppie in it at the beginning. Atheism makes more sense. And I already had criticism from people who are atheists saying, Why would you name it that? Atheism isn't a thing. It's the lack of a thing, of course. You know, and it's like, dude, wait till you see this interview. You're going to be shocked. We cover so much ground in so little time. There's just a lot of content that I've done. Consider helping us out, supporting us. Join MythVision Patreon. Any final words from you before we get these super chats?
No, I've really enjoyed this. I love talking about this stuff. Please, you know, grab my book, grab any of my books, all of my books, or none of them. Do what you like, but it'll be nice support. It helps me do what I do and continue to do that. If you appreciate what I do, and if you don't, sorry.
If you'd like, I can just bypass their libertarian free will and cause everybody to get the books. If you would be interested,
That would be cool.
Okay. Well, when we're done with this episode, I'll make sure that I do that. Just, you know, doing my God thing, you know. Doc Pluromanaut says, corkage fee for Jonathan for the bottle of Hattingly sparkling I am having. Is that Hattingly?
Yep. That sounds good, Doc. He sometimes like appreciates, occasionally I have a glass of wine on some of my videos, and he partakes mutually, I think. So good man.
Doc is the man. Thank you so much, Doc. I really appreciate you. Seriously. Always coming through with some very intelligent questions and dialogue. And then Dalai Lama is also a member. Thank you for the super chat, and is a member of the YouTube channel. Tithing much love. Really enjoy Mr. Pearce's presence here. Mr. Pearce,
really kind. Thank you, Dalai Lama. That's really kind. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm always reminded when your name comes up of, I think it was the current Dalai Lama. I was getting bit by a mosquito on camera and like tried to shoo it away. And then by the third time on camera, slapped and killed the mosquito. And they went like, you just killed the mosquito. He said, look, after strike 3, you're out. You're not supposed to kill anything according to their philosophy. But he's like, listen, the mosquito doesn't get it. After strike 3, that's it.
Everyone's got a price. Everyone's got a tipping point.
Seriously, thank you so much. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, go get a book and never forget, we are MythVision.